Hi, welcome to I'm Not Playing That, the video game book club podcast in which my friends and I vote on a different game to play each month in our Discord and then chat about it for an hour or two. Our game this month is Planet Laika, and your hosts are myself, Patrick, and my friends Ben, Victor, Raf, and Kamal. Hope you enjoy listening, and thanks. Alright, okay, so let's start talking about Planet Laika then. How fun. So, I guess first thing to talk about would be, release window, publisher, developer, things like that. So it was released in 1999 for the original PlayStation, Japan only. We played a fan translation, published by Enix Corporation and co-developed by Quintet and Zeke. I think Quintet's probably a familiar name for a lot of people. Zeke probably not so much, but I mean, do you guys know anything about Quintet games, like thematically?
Am I right in thinking they were the guys who did Illusion of Gaia and Terra Enigma back on the SNES, or is that Zeke?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's 100% Quintet. And I think that's probably going to be interesting coming up later in conversation, kind of that SNES trilogy of games.
Yeah, I was interested to learn that when I looked into it because I've not played Illusion of Gaia or Terra Enigma, but I was surprised to learn that this was considered to be in like an informal thematic trilogy alongside those two games because this is very much against the perception I had of what those games were like, especially in terms of some of the dark themes that get explored.
No, absolutely. And I think like that SNES trilogy is much more traditional,
Hmm.
whereas Leica very much isn't. And I suppose we'll get into that, right? The state of Japanese media at that point, like following the release of a few things that I'm going to name drop later that influence the way, the people consume their media at that point in time. It's interesting to note that Zeke, specifically didn't really work on much. They did another game called, I forgot what it's called, Kowloon's Curse or something like that, which is
I'm seeing
apparently
Kowloon's Gate.
Kowloon's Gate. Thank you, Ben. Which is like considered a cult classic. I don't think it's ever been translated or fan translated, but that might be an interesting one to look at some point.
And am I right in thinking that this was Quintet's final game because this game sold like shit and basically bankrupted them?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised.
Are you telling
Honestly.
me this was an uncommercial video game?
Yeah, no way. You telling me this game didn't have mass market appeal at its heart of the design ethos?
I think to quote Ben, I can see why this never got translated or localized.
It should have at least been localized into Russian. They would have eaten it up over there.
I was gonna say I didn't mean that in like an insulting way. I meant it more in terms of this is not. I think the most modern relatable example of this is probably the Dark Souls games, where you have all of your lore explained through item descriptions almost entirely, and up until that point, that sort of style of conveying the narrative, I'd never seen it in a in a game before. Whereas it seems very, I don't know if it's a case of Eastern versus Western storytelling, but like a lot of the time you have like games like this where there is a story, but it's very much kind of just about there, and the focus is more about the type of things that are happening as opposed to how they are happening. And I think that I don't know if that's the case, generalization amongst Eastern media in general, but like I think that's very much the case with this game, and that's why I think that a lot of that. I think people in the West maybe like to have things explained to them as opposed to not having that. So I think in terms when I said this wouldn't make it to the West, what I meant was to say what I meant was this narrative style is not very adapted to the American hive mind.
I think the game was kind of rushed. To be fair,
Definitely.
it felt like the first 6-ish hours they were like, "Cool, we have an idea of what we're doing here,"
Yeah.
and then like the last four, just the story comes out of nowhere and just here you go, here's the ending. You're
I
like,
think
"Oh,
you can really see that the most through the obviously the gameplay, the gamey aspect of the play um, revolves around using the side personalities to I think the better example is to give an example. At the start, there is a couple of instances, like I can't remember what the woman does, but there's a part where you need to turn into the little blue man because he can see an eye in
Love that,
the
dude.
door.
I can't imagine how confused people must be about the sentence when you have to turn into the little blue man.
Don't forget to mention his Jimmy Neutron hair. That's important.
And he's an absolute freak. He scares me.
Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I think maybe we should explain what Planet Laika is and at least give an introduction to
idea.
the story at this point.
Oh yeah, and I was just going to say, going back to sort of the way it's written, it felt to me like it surprised me in the sense that it seemed to be written with a sort of literary sort of edge to it that you can expect from video games more nowadays in the last decade as it started to take itself a bit more seriously as an art form and try to tell stories on the same sort of level as books and films, especially in the indie sphere. But I was very surprised that a game like an RPG released by Enix on the PS1 had that kind of feel to it as well, in the sense that it felt like it was more about presenting and exploring themes than delivering a narrative with mass market appeal.
Mm-hmm. And I think to start at the very beginning, the introduction really kind of sets that expectation, I felt, right? Because you're beginning with I don't know, he's almost like
there's a mission.
But even before that, it's kind of set up with this narrator character, right?
Oh yes.
Oh, of
This
course,
strange, rotund-looking fat controller fella.
I love him.
And he describes it as a story. He says this story is about this,
Yeah.
and this is what you want to. But then again, I suppose he says this story is about this, and not maybe he's emphasizing the this and not the fact that it is a story.
Still,
I don't know.
It's a strange opening, right? Because it almost immediately disconnects you from what's about to happen throughout the actual game. Because you've got this character you know nothing about, and he's essentially telling you, yeah, you're going to be part of this plot line, but it really is just a story. It's something that I'm telling and relaying to you.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting way to start your. Well, we described it as an RPG, and we'll get into the actual RPG elements as we go, and how there aren't really any. But
I was going to say singular.
I was gonna say that I thought that the game was trying to do a thing where you, the player, and you, the character, are going to have a disconnect of some kind. Like he was saying that he kept on referring to. I believe he referred to yourself, or he referred to like he was kind of implying it was you.
Yeah.
In some So I always thought, oh, are you trying to say that during this game I'm going to control the character, but maybe there'll be a moment where I can't control him and I'm going to have to watch him do something, and this is now him. It's not me. And I thought that might have been what was happening. Some weird thing that will change how that worked. I was like, that's interesting, but it never really happened.
I mean, the game kind of does that.
You're referring to
onto
Phoenix.
I'm referring to Phoenix as well, but I'm also referring to the fact that once you give yourself up to the personalities as Laika, then you have no control over what they say to other characters. You get to control the character in moment to moment movement and guide them around, but once they actually engage in conversation, because Laika is silent, obviously you get to infer what you want. But once you give up control to the personalities, it's like you're not really playing as them anymore. But that's that's a conversation for games as a whole, right?
Yeah, and I mean, there's also the aspect the whole sort of premise of the gameplay with Laika having their autonomy taken away by these sort of fragments of their personality. In a way, you could be considered the secret fourth or fifth personality that is controlling Laika throughout the entirety of the game.
Yeah, excellent point. All right, let me recap the story from the beginning, at least. So we talked a bit about that fella at the beginning, the fat controller, I'm going to call him, because I don't think he gets named, right?
No,
I think it gets suggested at the very end that he might be Father Christmas, right?
Yes,
you're
the
right.
post-credit scene
that
is Father
true.
Christmas.
Yeah.
But he's the ugliest looking Father Christmas I've ever seen.
That's a good point. Is there any reasoning for it being Christmas beyond just the presents? Like,
let's set up the plot first, and then we can talk about Christmas, because I think that is really important. So, the whole point of Planet Laika is you play as Laika, right? And Laika's the nickname of this astronaut, I suppose, is the simplest term to describe them. And you're on a mission to Mars with 3 other people, Captain Tatler, Noon, and April. And the whole point is, I mean, we were trying to discuss the plot earlier. We believe that the initial point, right, is they're checking in on the terraformation project, which is making Mars hospitable for human life. And I say human like that with invisible inverted quotes, because everybody's got dog faces, right? Everyone's an animal. Specifically, they're all dogs.
Why is that?
Because they're called Laika. That's
Yeah, the dog that got sent into space.
Yeah.
The Russian one.
But they specifically have dog faces in game, right? Because
and tails.
and tails. As
Yeah,
well.
that is odd. Because I thought the significance was specifically faces, but they do also have tails.
Yeah, because the whole point was that the Martians were attacking Earth at some point in time. We don't get to see this, but to broker peace, the humans offered the Martians their faces. Now, take from that what you will. I was very confused at first. I don't know about you guys.
And it's important to say that all the Martians died when they took our faces because they were quote unquote being something they weren't.
That's what I wanted to get into,
It
because
was because they were a hive mind and
Yes,
they couldn't
yes.
handle our individuality. The
yes,
losers.
that's something that I'll maybe get into
So
it later.
about
but that
3
was it.
minutes in, you've got individuality, the hive mind breaking down, faces, and all of that
What
stuff.
is between a face and an individual? Where those two things, are they the same? Do they overlap? Where are the similarities and where are the differences? How much of us is our face? Is our face?
We're getting ahead of ourselves there. Those
Yeah.
are fantastic questions, but I think it's worth noting that at that point in the game, you don't know that. At that
Yeah,
point in the
yeah.
game, the characters discuss that they think the Martians went extinct because of facial bacteria.
Oh yeah, I forgot that being mentioned.
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, we're aliens to them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And yeah, there is, later on it is revealed, of course, and this is going to be full spoilers as well, I think. I don't know how many people care about Planet Laika spoilers at this point. But yeah, the point about, individuality and what that meant for the Martians and what that means for the humans with their dog faces is something definitely worth exploring. But to finish kind of recapping, at least setting us up for how the game progresses, this crew, I'll say their names again, Laika, Captain Tatler, Noon, and April, are on a mission to Mars in a spaceship to check up on the terraforming project, but also the previous kind of expedition that was sent to Mars that was made up of Captain Galil. Is that right? Commander Galil?
Yeah, I think it's Commander.
Yeah, Galil, he's gone AWOL. He's gone missing. No one can find him. So kind of the secondary objective of the mission, and what might actually be implied to be the main crux of the mission, is to actually check up on Galil, right? To find him, to see what he's been doing. And in order to do that, the first thing that these guys have got to do when they arrive on Mars is essentially make it to the colony, which is made up of outcasts and criminals. It's basically a penal colony, right? So that's kind of the basic setup of the game. Very simple, relatively easy to explain. But as we'll discuss, things go wrong almost instantly, right?
Yeah.
Soon as they take a step out of that spaceship, they get insulted by the "I'm going insane" rocks from Mars.
I think before that, it's as they're landing, the big purple mist comes in and has a word.
The evil mind.
Evil
The
mind.
evil mind, yeah. So I think it's worth noting that once the Martians experienced mass extinction from wearing the humans' faces, that basically the residual bad feelings from the Martians, they call it evil mind, right? It's this evil residue that permeates the entire planet, and occasionally, well, not occasionally, but there's flashes of it appearing on Earth as well at this point in time. but if you breathe in this purple mist or you're present near this purple mist, you hallucinate essentially, right? And maybe it's worth starting off talking about, you know, what kind of memories those hallucinations bring up, because I believe it's Noon, right, is the first to experience hallucination.
I think this is interesting because one of the things that gets asserted early on about this mist, and particularly with regard to is that the memories it causes aren't always true.
Yeah. And by the end of the game, I had no idea which memories might have been fake. I kind of just assumed everything as fact by the end.
Yeah, because these hallucinations, right, are audio, they're visual, and they're very surreal, and you get to experience them, right? They change the actual background of the game. You know, these are inhabitable spaces for you to explore. And Noon's first hallucination is centered around his mother, right? So that's the first one he has where he's crying out for his mother. And maybe we should talk about the significance of that, because it's implied that all four central characters, are hallucinating at that moment in time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that at the very beginning of the game, it very much sets up, one, the importance of motherhood, but two, the importance of the past. And there are some times that you are in the hallucination and you are seeing everything, but there are other times where you are very much seeing other people hallucinate, and you are aware that they are seeing stuff you are not seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is going to be and the game at its best moments shows those interesting reactions that people are having, and also just how they're held back by their past a lot of the time. And Noon is one of the more tragic examples, I would say, of that having happened.
Yeah, and I'd say easily Noon is the most, probably mentally weak of the crew at that point. He's the first to experience the hallucination, and outside of the hallucinations, he's the most hot-headed, right? I believe he has a slight Scottish dialect in the fan
He does.
translation. Yeah, and he's kind of loud, he's brash, and towards your character, Laika, who we should also explain that Laika is just a nickname for the central character, right? So you actually get to name your character in this game. It'd be interesting to find out, what did you guys name your character, because it always ends with the suffix "nov," no matter what you name the character, right?
And it doesn't tell you, which I think was an especially nice touch.
I just named it after myself.
Yeah, I was Raphael Nov, which is not a good
How did you
of
fit
vowels.
Raphael in? I thought it only let you put 5 characters in.
I guess you're Rafa. No, well, Rafanov.
Yeah, that Rafanov works extremely well,
I was
actually.
going to say Benov worked pretty good too.
Benov, nice.
Yeah, I was happy with Viknov.
I had Theonov, which was pretty alright. And what did you have, Kamal?
I had Kamal Nov, but I would have loved. Yeah, I know. I would have liked, and it's because it's 5 letters, and it's 5 letters only. So if it was Kamala Nov, it would sound better, and that kind of annoyed me. I always read it at that afterwards.
It's interesting as well, isn't it, that, you know, depending on the situation and the character, you are either referred to as Laika or the name you have actually given yourself, and there's a lot of significance, I feel, you know, depending on which character is talking to you and which name they're using, and also which name you choose to use yourself, I guess, you know, in identifying the character. I mean, you mentioned it earlier, Kamal, but, you know, do you think there's any other reason for the main character to be called Laika or have their nickname as Laika, other than a reference to, you know, the real life Laika?
I mean, you're Russian as well. Like, it's heavily implied that you are Russian, you are from Russia, and like, I'm assuming you're, I guess in this instance, a cosmonaut along with the other 3. Which I see. I don't know if there's any real significance in that. Is it just because they were the first to get to space before the Americans?
I think it's probably an aesthetic reason as well, right?
Yeah, the whole game seems very preoccupied with an aesthetic of like 50s and 60s Russia.
Yeah, and sort of that. Well, that's been cosmonaut. It speaks to a particular era of space travel. But one thing I will quickly say is that for Laika, their original name will of course have a lot of relationship to their family life. Their family life was not great.
Mm-hmm.
It was quite tragic, to be honest. So I can imagine picking a name like Laika, so that it's not as front and center.
And am I right in thinking was Laika was sort of a code name or a title that the character adopted when they became a cosmonaut, right?
It could have been from that book.
Yeah, because I was thinking, I think there's like probably a transition point between when the character.
It does very seem like a title in that whenever he's being referred to or they're being referred to in a mission sense, it's always like particularly by commanding officers. But then whenever the other crewmates are talking to them, often it's more like often they use the Nov name.
Yeah, I think I interpreted it as being that the Nov name is obviously the character's birth name. It's the identity that the character had during their very traumatic childhood. And then Laika was an identity they adopted to escape that, and particularly to, as we'll probably get into a bit later, try to succeed the character's dead father in becoming a cosmonaut. So I thought that Laika was perhaps an identity that your character adopted to distance themselves from their traumatic past.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I also think, just to maybe wrap a bow on the kind of Laika conversation, going back to the namesake, the actual Laika, I think it's probably worth noting how much this sets up the tone of the game. Because Laika was essentially a dog that was sent into space to die, right?
Yeah.
It was a
Yeah.
dog that was put on a tin can and sent off for scientific reasons, and there was no chance of recovering that animal. And I think that speaks a lot to the general, at least, well, I'd say through most of the game, right? Because I don't know about you guys, but I did not expect this game to be as dark
No.
as it ended up being.
Absolutely not. But you're right that as soon as you hear the game's title, it instantly like impresses upon you that this is probably not going to be a game with a happy ending, just based on the ending of the real life Laika.
Yeah, absolutely. And, shortly after they land on Mars to begin, right, things get, they hallucinate a bit on the ship, like you mentioned, Ben. Noon talks about his mother. I don't know if Tatler's...
Do you want to go through the backstories one by one, or at least what we know about them at this point?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay, yeah, that probably is good, because that is discussed on the ship, right? So, should we start with...
I think Noon's probably first, right?
Okay, yeah, so let's start with Noon, who... Well, it's kind of pieced together as we go on. All we know at the beginning is that he calls out for his mother, right? But I think the implication through him calling out to his mother, through the words that he uses, is we are unsure if this is a good thing, right? We're not sure if he's calling out to his mother because he misses his mother, or he's calling out to his mother because he's afraid.
Yeah, it's definitely apparent that he has some sort of complex, but you don't really know what it's based in at that stage.
Absolutely. So, does anyone want to handle kind of what happens there, with the backstory?
Do we want to go? Are we going to go fully into it, or are we going to do it piece by piece as we go through a bit more?
Yeah, that's a good point, because kind of a lot of these backstories really come to the forefront once you get to the mining village, right?
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying that a lot of this game's stories, there is an overarching story as you bounce from character to character and sort of get led on this winding journey. But a lot of sort of the key themes and just experiences of this game can really be done character by character and sort of say, this is what this character was about and this is what their backstory. So actually, I think we should just go through the interesting characters and sort of talk about, because the overarching story, I would say, got a bit confusing. And I don't know how many people would agree with me. And so maybe that's something worth talking about near the end.
Why don't we use the general plot as a pit stop? A very brief kind of overview of what happens next, and then we can kind of fill in the blanks from there. Because I think that might help us remain structured kind of as we go, right? So we're not hopping around too much. So maybe it's worth talking about Noon's backstory once we get to it, which I think we can get to pretty quickly.
Yeah, and his does come up first, and it's kind of...
Well, can someone remind me what happens to Captain Tatler? Because I genuinely
Very
can't
little.
remember. Noon is the first one that I remember something interesting
The thing
happening.
is, Tatler's girlfriend, or whoever it was, the person he had a relationship and who his kind of trauma was based on, got more screen time than he did, which is interesting.
I was going to say, at this point, it's very much a flash, and everyone kind of sees a face of someone that's their key past figure. For Noon, it's his mother. For Tatler, it's his I'm assuming former lover Chloe, who died, and then for the remaining two, I believe
You see a room.
April sees a
for
room.
April.
Yeah, she
Mhm.
sees a room, an empty room that was her bedroom, I think. And then you get put in this scene with a sort of toy box
Yeah, yours is essentially a childhood room as well, right?
with
As like
a big looming figure looking down through an open
Yeah,
door.
that was a great scene, by the way. Yeah, just like the composition where you are one of the toys essentially, because you're the aesthetic of the game is basically that all of your characters look like little plastic cosmonaut action figures, and this is
Mhm.
probably the bit where it's most relevant to the themes because you're sitting about a big room filled with Christmas presents to represent Laika's Christmas, and the characters relevant to Laika are looming above you.
Yeah, it's got that wonderful pre-rendered moment, doesn't it, where the shadow
Yes.
the door swings open, and all you can see is the shadow of some figure on the back wall, which is really, really impressive stuff. I thought great cinematography.
It's both strong, but also, immediately speaks to family's going to be a big theme.
Mm.
And abuse is also probably going to be a big theme.
Yeah, because I mean, moving straight on from that, as soon as they land on the planet, they've already experienced these hallucinations, but because of Noon's state of mind, they decide to basically, before they get to the penal colony, camp out right at a safe station. But immediately a sandstorm hits. A few of the members get separated. Well, Laika does it first, right? So you've got to move through to this safe little space. It's basically like a little encampment. And at this point, you just think that Noon's really the one who's taking the brunt of it, right? But as soon as you get to this encampment and all of the characters meet back up, it's quite clear that Tatler has also lost it immediately after basically admonishing Noon for not being mentally strong enough to deal with the evil mind. You start hearing Tatler going on about having to find Chloe, right? And people are, I think April specifically is trying to dissuade him from doing so, but he basically walks out into Mars to try and find Chloe.
They
Right?
both immediately wander off by themselves, searching for their
Yeah.
relevant.
Yeah.
And actually, I find it interesting how alone you are for a lot of this game.
Yeah, it does not really feel like your crew are supporting you in any way. It doesn't feel like Laika is part of a team outside of the first few minutes on the ship.
Yeah, and I think that was a good, interesting choice to sort of make you feel lost on this planet far, far away.
Yeah, I do wonder if, because as I think we've said, it's pretty obvious that this game had a lot of likely cut or trunculated content. I wonder if there was at the conceptual stage that it might have been the case that these might have been party members for you, and the battle system might have been expanded a bit to incorporate all four characters. It definitely seemed like that could have been the case, I thought.
Yeah, it's interesting to note, isn't it? I mean, maybe that's a good segue into talking about the battle system, because the first battle comes out pretty soon after this. Is it before you enter the penal colony?
I believe it's a screen or two before, and
It's in Brick Road. It's in Brick Road
I
directly.
swear it's after, isn't it? When you forget your first personality.
It is,
to come
because
out?
you don't battle ever when you're just Laika. It's always when you're one of the alter egos.
I thought you get to the colony, and then it's like, oh yeah, April's gone to Brick Road or whatever, and you leave, and then you change into your personality of what's his name, Ernest, and then you get your first battle. And luckily I found out that the battle system is incredibly easy after the first boss because you just hold it down. You do nothing else.
Well, yeah. Let's talk about the battle system real quick.
It
Then.
won't
So
take long.
it's essentially all the gameplay in this game, apart from talking to people and selecting options and doing things in the right order. It's basically, what would you call it, like battle pong, essentially, right? So you're faced off against a creature. There's this weird aliens. They're like, I don't know. Does the game really explain what they are? They're faces.
They're
They're
phases, which are
masks.
things
Yeah.
that aren't they things that have arisen from the evil mind.
sometimes they're sort of like implied to be like specters that have come from the evil mind. Sometimes they're implied to be like the spiritual aspects of characters that you are currently encountering, and other times they're just kind of abstract things.
Mm.
It varies.
And there's not many of them, right? I would say that you probably spend a grand total of 20 to 30 minutes actually battling in this game, maybe a little bit more. But it's essentially set up that the personality, and we'll get to the split personalities as well, but the personality that is inhabiting Laika at the time sits on the left-hand side of the screen. On the right-hand side of the screen, you have the enemy, and they essentially fire little balls at you. And you have your own ball that's going up and down on a set path, and you can press A to move it forward, closer to where the enemy's balls are coming from, and the object is to reflect their balls back at them, right? And there's I know you're laughing at balls. I'm trying. This is the best way to explain it, but also they send out
They're
little
mind cores.
mind cores. I'm very
Spiritual
sorry.
energy. Just
Yeah, but it's spherical spiritual energy. And then, they send out. You can get health pickups from that they send out, and I think the key really in the battle system, right, is to hit the little diamonds that
Yeah,
immediately reflect all of the
I always
enemies.
found that extremely satisfying, especially in like situations where you're in a bit of a pinch because there are a million projectiles on screen coming towards you, and then you reverse it at the last second. So instead of you taking an enormous amount of damage, the enemy takes an enormous amount of damage.
Yeah, and I think Kamal is right, as in that the battle system is incredibly easy once you understand it, because it's not explained
Yes.
to you. So I think I died once during the second battle in the game, and then after that I was fine. Did anyone else have that experience?
I think I died. Yeah, I died in the first battle. Not in the first boss battle. And then I was like, I'm just gonna hold it down and see what happens. And then discovered that was you never
You
lose if
actually
you
do
do that.
damage when your ball gets to them. It damages them, and then it doesn't
Oh,
go
I
back
didn't
to
know
you
that.
either. So you
God.
can kind of keep it there for. But no, it does. Sorry, it does ping back.
No,
to
it
you.
does. When it hits him, it immediately goes back to you, and then you just start the process again. Because from what I understood, since it goes in like a wave, it will always it will hit most of what is being thrown at you. It's kind of like the game is throwing it at you in time with the ball going down and up.
Yeah.
And if you time that perfectly, you will hit most back, and that's where most of your damage comes from.
Whenever there was a massive wave of them coming at me, I was like, oh shit, how am I going to deflect all of these? But then it kind of just handles itself quite easily.
Mm. And I would say, like, apart from the visual design of the enemies, which I think was quite excellent.
They were, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of drawn a lot of stuff. I'd say that the battle system and that kind of mechanical component was by far the least important part of the game.
Yeah.
Right, it's not what the game's about.
Hang on a minute, you're telling me the gameplay wasn't the most important part of the video game?
And I was going to say, I do agree that it was the least important part and kind of felt like an afterthought. But I think it was probably also my favorite part of the game.
I was about to say, I think the fact that it was so unique and so like, I want to say abstract, but like, just in terms of the fact that it was nothing like anything else in the game, but at the same time, there was kind of this. It also by having both of you shooting balls at each other, it also kind of puts you in a similar. I don't want to say empathy, but it implies that you're similar to the things that you're fighting, and it like.
It's quite a good visualization of deflecting a mental assault on, like a psyche.
And I think there's like two other things important to say. That one, it does just add variety, and that's important. Sort of, there does need to be some gameplay, even if it is sort of surprisingly decent for how simple it is. But the other thing is just I feel you kind of do need a climax in this game, because I feel
Yeah.
that if it really was just, oh, I've said the right words to this person, now they've melted into goo. Like, I don't think it would have the same impact. I think you personally have to. We're playing video games. I've got to beat the other person, and I feel that was. I think the game is stronger for it rather than being a pure point and click style
I agree.
adventure game.
I would have found my interest waning, I think, if there wasn't occasional moments of gameplay.
I guess what I meant by least important is that it sounds like what you guys really enjoyed was the thematic elements surrounding the gameplay, as opposed to the actual moment-to-moment gameplay itself.
I did enjoy the thematic elements, but I think my favorite thing about it was the gameplay. I thought whether it was intended by the designers or not, I thought there was a lot of sort of good mechanical quality to the gameplay.
I'm quite interested in that because I thought it was pretty dull, honestly.
Well, the thing I thought first of all is that I think the game basically had just about the right amount of combat in it, where there are a handful of random encounters that you really didn't have to get into unless you needed to, and then other than that, it was essentially just maybe for every hour or 90 minutes of gameplay, you'd have a boss encounter, and I think that was about right because obviously the gameplay isn't especially deep. Which means if you did too much of it, you just completely master it and it would become a chore. But I think there was just about the right amount where I felt like every time I got into a new boss encounter, I'd improved at the gameplay a little bit. But I also thought, there was a lot of stuff to it that made it interesting and fun. Like I thought it had a nice risk versus reward element where you can hold your little sphere back, in which case you're going to be better at deflecting orbs that are coming at you because you have more time to react to them. But what you really want to do is you want to get in close so that you can deflect more orbs at the opponent. Because if you deflect the orbs from further back, they usually get caught up in the other orbs that are behind them, which neutralizes both of them. So you can kind of quite make a quite interesting choice between being more defensive and getting up in the enemy's face and being more aggressive.
Yeah. No, I definitely respect that. Like, I guess it comes down to the question is there's probably a deeper question in general around what do you expect from a video game, mechanically. I think personally, as someone who values narrative and thematic elements first, I could have done without it, but I completely respect that, there is a nuance to it that adds to the experience rather than takes away from it.
Yeah. It's certainly nice that because it was such an obvious afterthought, it was also, very unique. Like we've been saying, there's not really any other battle system I can think of in any game that's quite like it. So someone must have given it a bit of thought.
I suppose, like, moving on from that as well, talking about the fact that you can only enter battles once Laika has split into one of their personalities is worth mentioning because I don't think we've touched upon that yet, right? I mean, I guess it's the central crux of the game as well, is that Laika has multiple personality disorder and is inhabited by, at least at this point when we know in the game, reaching the, traveling to the penal quality, 3 separate personalities living inside them. And I think the first one that makes itself apparent is Ernest.
The
Yeah.
powerful one.
Yeah, the kind of the one with the red hair. And it's worth noting as well that Laika is silent, but these 3 personalities are all exactly that, distinct personalities that when they inhabit Laika, not only change the way that Laika speaks, but change their physical appearance as well. And I guess that's the other, going back to gameplay, that's the other mechanic, right? Is that you build up certain energy by speaking to people or finding it scattered around the world. And once you reach a maximum amount of that specific energy, they're color coded, and they all have different names, don't they? Which is
It's power, wisdom, and is the last one greed or envy?
or pride, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and each personality manifests once you've reached the maximum. You've reached the maximum of that kind of energy type, and basically you look in a mirror. So you experience ego death, essentially.
It also, whenever you speak to someone, I noticed that the other 2 personalities, one would sort of be slightly subdued, and the other one would be massively subdued. So, like, you would, if you're 100% on power, I'm assuming your wisdom would be at the lowest, and your, what was it, you said greed or pride would be in the middle, and it would work the other way
Oh,
around
that's
as well.
interesting. I didn't notice that.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I think probably the reason you didn't notice it, Victor, is that it's never really used in a puzzle solving way.
No.
As in, once you know which personality you want, you just speak. You can basically speak to the same character who has their energy over and over again and build it back up. And I thought the game might introduce some elements where you have to go out of your way or do things in a certain order in order to build up the energy to manifest the personality. But it really doesn't. right?
Yeah.
Like, the game even gives you items from random battles that you can use to basically instantly manifest a personality, but I never found myself using them.
Yeah, can someone raise their hand if they ever used an item?
I think I used it once, and then it turned out that it wasn't even for the personality I needed, so I wasted it completely.
I didn't. Yeah.
Yeah, the game doesn't really tell you, right? The item descriptions are quite limited, so yeah, apart from the ones that regain health, there's ones that regain health.
Speaking of items, did you go and give the dream items to the woman?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, we'll definitely get onto that. Yeah. But okay, let's move on to.
If you want to give this a title, I think the title should be "We'll Get to That."
Yeah, I think so too. We are. I don't know. This could run on for 4 hours, so we'll try and.
Do you want to
speed
rush
along.
to the colony and then you can start talking about
If
the characters?
I can just say one more thing before we move on from that aspect of the gameplay, it felt like to me, as anemic as it was originally, even still as the game progressed, it felt like it kind of gave up on that mechanic as well, because it just started automatically bringing out the person that you needed at specific points in the story towards the second half,
Mhm.
which I
I
didn't
honestly
mind.
can't remember a time I tried to become a particular person. I just became person, looked in the mirror, and got further.
That's deep. That hits me at my core.
Raph is always exactly who he needs to be.
But okay, so the characters, well, I say the characters, essentially it's just Laika at this point, and April's kind of floating about in the background, right? She's disappearing and reappearing. Noon and Tatler have completely gone AWOL, you don't know where they are. But you arrive at the penal colony, which is populated by, would you call them freaks and geeks? Societal outcasts,
Little
right?
Tim Burton critters is how I thought of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you described them as Willy Wonka characters,
I
Ben.
did. It was the perfect. I think that's the level of. I think this is the ratio of whimsy to sinister that I felt that occupied.
I agree to an extent, but I think I found personally that they devolved much more into sinister, both visually and kind of
Yeah.
personality wise. They're pretty gross, right? Because like, who are
Yeah.
the first characters you meet in town? Really,
Is it East and West,
I
or is
think
it?
it's yeah, East and West are the bodyguards for Herod, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, in the oxygen factory or mine.
dispensary, I think it is. Yeah.
Don't you meet the drunk guy who's always vomiting every
Oh
time you
yeah.
talk to him?
Yeah, him too. And it's just like, I mean, all these
Laika.
characters. no Kilroy posting.
I didn't say anything.
But we yeah, all these characters are significant in their own ways, and we'll get into that. And I don't think we have the time or space to talk about each of them individually, but we should probably talk about the relevance of the penal colony at this point in time. And what is the objective at this point? The objective really, at this point, even so quickly early on in the game, this is within, the first 40 minutes to an hour, the terraforming mission is basically completely out the window, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they
Yeah.
are still there to check up on things, but really the overwhelming mission at this point is, okay, well, we've got to get the crew back together. We've got to find Tatler and Noon, and I think even April is probably missing at this point. I'll be honest, April kind of came and went so regularly.
Yeah, she was extremely flaky.
Not only that, I think, but early on when you first get there, you try and go to the authority figures and the people. You get sort of ushered around the main kind of areas of the plot. So you have, like, we can go into more detail, but you've got obviously the bar, the face surgery clinic. Then you have the psycho lab and the oxygen factory. I think you go to the oxygen factory first because that's where the main Herod leader guy is. And the very first impression you get from almost all the characters you meet in that building is this idea of, firstly, resentment for the people of Earth, presumably as a penal colony or as a outcasted colony. But secondly, this notion of independence, in that they very strongly believe that they've done everything themselves, and they were the ones who've done everything, and they don't need you to do anything.
But also,
it's
been because it's been years
Yeah.
since their last contact, so they really are sort of disconnected from you. And also, when you start really going around, there's no easy way to say it. Some of them just look like freaks. Like, they're not even anthropomorphic dog creatures anymore, some of them.
Yeah, they're absolutely
And you really
horrifying.
sort of see how different these people are.
Yeah, you do have to wonder if, like, that's the result of multiple generations of genetic mutation from living on Mars surrounded by the evil mind, or if that's what they were like when they were first exiled to Mars.
Well, I think that's implied, right, by the notion that they all have this type and this aura that whether or not it's because they live in proximity to it or that they have always been on proximity to it, but it's definitely assimilated into their being in
Yeah,
some
that's very
form.
true.
That's some good ass discussion. I enjoyed that. I'll be honest, I didn't consider that.
That's good.
but-
I'm going to the bathroom now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Are you actually going to the bathroom, Ben?
He's muted himself.
Okay. Should we wait for Ben to get back?
We don't need 5 minutes of silence.
Okay. The relevant characters to talk about here would be East and West, Agatha and Herod, right? Like in the oxygen dispensary.
So they're some of the first characters we see from the colony.
Yeah, and we barely meet Herod, right?
No.
Herod is an important character who doesn't get much screen
Yeah,
time. Would that
I'll be
fair
honest.
to
All the
say?
way to the end, I spent my time not understanding what Herod's deal was.
So Herod's whole thing is that he suffers from nightmares, right?
Yeah, and he lives within his nightmares as well.
He has this whole sort of thing where he gets trapped within this nightmare realm, which you actually get to see at certain points in the game. But it seems to me that Herod's whole deal is that he's trapped between two realities, right? He's trapped but in, what we perceive to be Laika's reality within the penal colony within everyone else living there, and this nightmare realm, which is never really explained in much detail, but the whole point is he's in and out of scenes a lot, as in, he's just gone for long amounts of time, and the excuse is, well, he's lost in the nightmare realm.
He's dreaming, bro.
He is dreaming, apparently he's just asleep in the back somewhere and we can't see it.
Yeah. I think my favorite Herod scene is the one where, for some reason, your perspective is that you're underneath the floor of the colony and you see him standing above you.
Just
I
chilling.
quite enjoyed towards the end in the nightmare. There's a scene, the scene where you meet him in the nightmare, and he's lying down, but he's floating about 6 foot above you, and he just kind of floats in from the right hand side of the screen.
Yeah.
Coming in towards you to describe the situation he's in.
Oh, and the noise that he makes, which I think in the game is described as like a banging, but sounds more like him sort of convulsing horribly, I quite enjoyed as well when he's in distress towards the end of the game.
Yeah, and the reason I call Herod an important character as well in relation to everything we just talked about is he's one of the few characters who gets a CG cutscene.
That's true.
Dedicated to him.
Introductory cutscene, yeah.
Yeah, which is pretty, that's not cheap.
Yeah.
1999 PS1.
He is very clearly the head ninja in charge of the colony.
Yeah. And I suppose the relevance of, probably the character who's most openly nice to you, basically who's not a complete weirdo and still openly nice to you, is Agatha, right? Madam Agatha, who's kind of a psychic.
She also gets an introductory cutscene, but hers is much more not straightforward. Whereas with Herod's, he very clearly steps into frame. He's accompanied by his entourage. He's very much displayed as a figure of power. Whereas Agatha, I don't think you realize who she's introduced to you while you're talking to somebody else, and you see her with April kind of from across the courtyard, but the central plaza of the town, and it kind of does this. They have this kind of very kind of unconventional camera angle where she kind of slides on and she kind of flies at the camera a little bit, and there's April there too. And then I don't know if that's straight away at that point, or somewhere later on, but I think early on somebody says you shouldn't trust her, which is interesting because the entire rest of the game happens around she never. I don't know if it was just me. I didn't notice, but I don't think she ever had her own motivations at any point during the game other than helping Herod.
She's the most mysterious character by far, right? It's so many characters tell you not to trust her.
And I think it seems like it's quite deceptive in that even though Herod is introduced as the one who is in charge of the colony, in a way, it is really Agatha who's in command, because Herod relies on her to keep his nightmares at bay. I think other characters in the colony do as well through her hypnotherapy. So I think she's, even though it's not apparent at the start, she's probably the one who holds the most power over most of the people in the colony.
Mm. And and at this point in time, it's worth, as you mentioned, Ben, like pretty much everyone in the penal colony treats you and the rest of the Earthlings with disdain. They don't want you being there, but also, there's a lot of internal politicking going on and internal relationships that you're not privy to, and they don't really care that much about you at this point, right? The whole idea is that you're here, find your friends and leave, basically. And I suppose that leading on to kind of the next plot beat within the game is someone says that they've essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, that they've seen Noon in. Now, does anyone remember the name of the place?
Oh,
It's
God,
essentially
no.
the mining.
It was in Latin, I think. It was like
the mining facility, right? But it has a
Valley
specific name.
Incognalis or
Valley Vallius Memorius.
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Yes.
Or something like that. I can edit in the correct place, but
I think it'd be more funny if we just said it wrong the entire rest of the show.
Valilus Mimosimus. And so you have to go there, essentially, right? But, in between that, and we're skipping over a few things here, you're using, specifically, we mentioned, the violent personality Ernest to not solve puzzles, but to talk to people in the right order. Yeah.
I think there's something else, there's another party you haven't mentioned, which might be, obviously there are kind of 3 or so. I forgot to mention an area in this. We haven't talked about the medicine man.
Yeah.
They haven't really come up yet, right?
Yeah,
The medicine
you
men
meet
come here
the first
after.
of them in the desert directly before you get to the brick road in the colony, but at that stage you don't really know what his significance is.
Acting as a tutorial figure, but then later, as you get to the colony, I think before you leave for the valley, you go to talk to them, and they kind of introduce you again to that. What I don't want to say what's going on, but they give you a kind of briefing of how the evil system works in terms of how people align to one of the 3 points on the triangle, and what that means for you in regards to the mirror.
Mm. Yeah, that is very important as well. And the medicine men are pretty integral, right, as things kind of ramp up and Galil becomes more relevant.
Yeah,
Within
and
the
it's like
overall plot.
in the setting of the colony where you don't really know who you can trust. The medicine men are probably the people you default to perceiving as the most trustworthy, especially since they don't have the aura surrounding them at any point.
And they are from Earth as well.
Yeah.
They're researchers, right? Was the implication, or they were researchers, but everyone's a little bit wacky on Mars.
They
right?
certainly are.
Well, yes, the medicine men do not look like men.
No, my favorite thing about them is the little floating pods that they all go around in. It's terrific.
Excellent peak character
Oh,
design.
to be a man in a floating pod.
I know, with a funny tribal headdress.
And we'll get to the dudes who are obsessed with the Venusian rays.
Oh my
as
god,
well,
those
who
are my absolute favorite in all the colonies. But yeah, we'll get on to them later.
are absolutely disgusting fellas.
Love them.
But
I love the culmination of their arc.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic.
let's move to Vallis Memorius, or whatever it's called, to discuss essentially finding Noon, right, which is the next large part of the game.
And it feels like the first massive dream sequence.
You haven't explained why we're finding Noon. It's because our ship, or Laika's ship, has been when it crashed, and it needs to be repaired, and he's the engineer.
I do like that it managed to crash standing up perfectly.
But it's got a trail of smoke coming out of it all the time, so you know it's
It's why Laika and everybody else is stuck on the planet. I mean, obviously they want to do their mission, which is to find Galil, but they can't right now.
Yeah, I was going to say the central mission at this point really is to find the rest of the crew.
Yeah, and it does feel like the game is just you bouncing between crew members after a certain point, or for the first big chunk of the game. and that's one of the things I will
And
complain
you
about
get
later.
towards the end, it feels like the plot only really starts progressing when Laika starts taking things into their own hands a bit more and stops thinking about having to have the crew with them to get shit done.
But anyways, we're going to the brick road, right? That's where we're going next. Or was that going too far?
So no, I think we should let's go straight to Valus Memorius, because obviously
Yeah.
the stuff you do in between, but Valus Memorius is essentially, well, it's a strange place, right? Because once you arrive there, it's essentially inhabited by, they're like miners, right, in a mining
Yeah, my
colony.
robots, right? I thought they were, or at least some.
Robots. I don't know. I thought they were people, but they could very well be robots. What was your thought process there, Victor?
I thought that a lot of them spoke in a very mechanical tone, and it might have been that it was just that they were covered in mining equipment, but it looked to me like they were sort of mechanical creatures.
Well, I get what you're saying there, because one of them, you could definitely interpret one of them as malfunctioning, right?
I think you could argue that they're all malfunctioning because they're all inside homes that have one door,
Yes.
and if you have to go into, you have to. So it's like a set where there's a door and a wall that you have to enter into a house that has no other walls, and if you don't enter it through the door, they won't talk to you.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting thing to know, and I was going to mention that it is a set, right?
To cut in, it's not even just the characters won't talk to you. I think later on you have to answer a message in one of the houses, and if you just walk up to it and press the thing, I don't think it works. You have to go in through the door for that as well. And there's also the obviously the scene with Noon towards the back end of the colony where you first explained how that mechanic works.
Yeah, so this area is heavily artificial, and you do feel that. Feels, it just feels very weird when you're around there, and not in, and weirder than the colony was
Yeah,
earlier
very
on.
much
You
so.
talking about the TV that you have to communicate through? We haven't talked about those people, have we? Captain October, Galil talks to you, and doesn't somebody else?
April does at one point. I think from what I remember, there was Galil, April, October does most of it.
We should explain what this is first. So,
Yeah.
throughout the game, it initially happens on the ship. Commander October speaks to you essentially remotely from Earth through a television screen, is what it is. It's a communication device. And these communication devices are around, strewn around the world, and you will hear them. They're beeping, right? Very audibly. And you go up and answer them, and you get a new message, mostly from Commander October, but like you guys were saying, other characters as well. There's that weird little bug guy who tells you about cockroaches at one point. But also, yeah, April and Galil also, enter the system at certain points to talk to you. But yeah, they're just getting that out of the way. That's kind of, the whole point of those is really October briefing you on the mission, right? So you can consistently update him on what's going on. But they, in classic fashion, they quickly go off the rails. I'm pretty sure after the first 2 times you talk to him, none of the ones after that make particular sense in regards to the mission anymore.
No, and I think there's a point when you're in the Psycho Lab, in the room with the two dudes who are obsessed with the Venusians that we were talking about. I don't know if you guys saw this, but if you examine the monitor in there, one of them says, "Oh, that monitor's not been working for ages. If you see any flashing lights, it's a glitch." Which I think I interpreted as
I didn't see
suggesting that
that.
most, if not all, of the messages that come through are actually hallucinations that Laika is experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. So yeah, there's one of these in the mining facility, and like we were saying, it is a set, right? It's like peeking behind the curtain. There's stalls everywhere. There's incomplete structures, and yeah, if you walk into these structures through the wrong way, if you don't enter through the front door, then most of the inhabitants won't speak to you. And this is where essentially you find now. I need to remember this. When do you first come across Tatler again? You do find him in this village,
Yeah, you
this
do.
facility,
I don't remember
don't
if it's
you?
before or after you find Noon.
I think it's after you find Noon for the first time.
There's the Noon section, and then there's the fire that happens. Then you are introduced to the cave beneath the village.
You find Tatler in the fire though, because he runs into the fire thinking that he's finding
Yeah,
Chloe.
that's right.
But let's discuss Noon first, I guess. So this is where Noon's backstory really comes into play, right? His whole thing with his mother. And I'd argue that this, at least for me, was the furthest that the game dipped into pure psychological horror. I think this was the scariest, in a traditional sense, scariest, most disturbing sequence of the game. Essentially, because the whole point is all the villagers, all the the miners, they all think that Noon has become the new village chief, right? That's the implication. And then they keep on telling you to go to the village chief's home. And the village chief's home is like you kind of leave this set area and you enter this ethereal kind of mental realm that Noon is inhabiting, and it's a nice kind of country manor, right? Floating in space. And you try and speak to Noon and you try and, essentially get him to leave. And at this point, I believe you're inhabiting Yolanda, right?
Oh, that's right, you are, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe we should talk about Yolanda's character as the personality that represents pride or greed or whatever we're thinking it was, the yellow one.
I think it's Ernest represents anger or wrath.
Yeah.
Spacer represents...
I think they say it's wisdom at one point.
It's got some sort of negative connotation.
Yeah, negative
though, right?
Yeah.
Obsessiveness, maybe. And then Yolanda, represents pride.
And I think it's also worth noting that Yolanda is the only female personality. And that once Yolanda inhabits Laika, everyone speaks to them as if they were a woman.
Yeah, and also Yolanda herself is very, very adamant about being female, brings it up constantly to a degree which seems a little bit unnatural, unless she had some kind of reason for it.
And she's probably the most... I don't know. For me, she was one of the personalities who had the most interesting dialogue. She's quite... she's very sassy, but she's very... she's quite biting and she's quite vulnerable in moments as well. But I think there's relevance to it being Yolanda who gets to explore the mining village because of the relevance of Noon's mother in this situation and I suppose the relevance of female characters in general for the game. I think in almost every situation in these backstories, it is the female component that is the most important, that is the key integral part of these backstories. And we find out basically from Noon. Noon doesn't want to leave this manor he's created for himself in his mind or whatever's happening here because he wants to stay with his mother. And then we get the flashback, right? And does anyone want to take the flashback and kind of run us through that?
It's been a while since I've played the damn game.
I can do it.
I
Then.
can barely remember. Please do it, yeah.
All right. So essentially, it's an argument between Noon's parents at this point. And at this point, you didn't know anything about Noon's father, right? And I suppose, if you were thinking about this in generic terms, and I know that, this isn't always the case, but I think most people would assume that the father would be the abusive case in the relationship, right? Almost like it was with the stepfather in Laika's case. But in this instance, Noon's parents are having an argument and he's a child, and Noon's mother picks up a knife and essentially, to cut a long story short, kills Noon's father in front of him and then calls out to Noon not to worry, come here. Everything's all right.
Yeah.
I had to do it. He was going to hurt us. I did this for us.
And if I remember right, doesn't she also tell him that he was weak and sick? Which I don't know if that was in a literal sense. Yeah.
Yeah, basically this idea of toxic protection, right? Or, this idea that he was going to do it, I had to kill him, and I had to do it for us, even though I killed a man, it was the right thing to do. It was for us. It was to protect
he was
family.
pathetic and he was useless and he wasn't helping us at all.
Yeah, and he was a weak man. And obviously, I think that comes, you can see that in Noon's character, right? He's abrasive, he's loud, he wants to get shit done, essentially, and he doesn't really want people to come along and help him. I mean, in that initial opening sequence, he's probably the most dismissive of Laika, right? Why is this person coming along? They're green, they're new, why do we need them? I can get this done by myself, essentially. And yeah, we kind of see Noon in this mental state revert back to being a child, calling out for his mother, being unable to help himself.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting how, because you're with April at this point as well, is that the both of you see what's happening to Noon, and you're not happy about it, or like you are disturbed by this. You can tell that that's not a good relationship. That Noon, like deep down, is kind of terrified of his mother and sort of what happened. Also, that she's not there, whereas you can clearly see that Noon, one, is crying out, wants her there, wants more of her, and two, won't listen to anyone that she's not there, that she's not real at the moment.
Mm.
And I think it was a nice touch that a bit later on they say, no, she's in jail, like she can't find you, because he is afraid of her. I think that's important to say, but he still wants her.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this was the first sort of, well, it was the first like prolonged look at one of the characters' backstories, and there will be a couple of these, but it's just that thing Patrick talked about, sort of horror. I sort of look at it more from like tragedy. Sort of like this is a grown man, sort of he's a successful cosmonaut, but he really does melt and becomes a child when all of this happens again, and it's quite tragic that sort of someone who isn't in his life anymore is actually holding him back and sort of making him regress.
I definitely think that the horror in this instance mostly comes from. I was quite shocked at the violence on display in this scene because you see
particularly in the FMV cutscene. From is it from the mother's perspective, the cutscene, or the father's?
Yes,
yeah,
it's from the mother's, and you see her plunge the knife in, and you see the blood.
Yeah, I thought that was very well done.
And I also think it's got I think it's got the game's biggest jump scare in it.
Yeah, that's right.
It's where you turn away from the window and the mother's arms reach out from the window to grab you from behind, and it flashes. And I was playing it quite late at night in bed, and that definitely made me jump quite badly. But yeah, that's I'd argue probably the most disturbing scene in the game. It's not the most disturbing implicit, it's not the most disturbing thing that's implied in Planet Laika, but it's probably the most disturbing thing we see on a visual basis.
Yeah, and again, it sets the tone of, this is going to have explicit domestic violence and family trauma and murder. And it's going to keep going, and it's going to get stronger and stronger as we go on.
Well, that's the thing as well, because you don't save Noon, right? You don't snap him out of it.
I forget, do we literally see him burn to death?
I don't think so, but we do come across him much later in the game and learn what his fate has been.
Yeah,
yes.
that's pretty gnarly. But the village essentially burns, right? Do you remember what the instigating factor for the village burning is? Is it something that you do?
I think it's just something that gets brought up as a result of Noon's breakdown, isn't it?
Yeah. So after his breakdown, there's a scene where you get kind of, I don't know if it's kind of, it didn't really feel attached to the rest of it. It felt like kind of almost a cheap pop, really. But there is a scene where you get called over to the window, and then a bunch of disembodied hands try and grab you, and then they don't.
Yeah, that's the jump scare part. Yeah.
And then after that happens, I don't remember if it's April or you get prompted to leave that screen, and then you go back. As soon as you leave the screen, the village is on fire.
Yeah. I think the way I'd see it is that obviously yourself and April are trying to snap Noon out of this fantasy that has been built around him by the town, or that he's built himself. So as you're perhaps getting through to him a little bit, the illusion might be starting to break down, which could be represented by the fire.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's panic stations, right? All the miners are freaking out, and I think this is where Tatler reappears.
Yes,
because you find him, and I don't know about you guys, but there's a moment of kind of, oh, thank God, someone else is here, and then you talk to Tatler,
and he's just as fucked up as Noon is, basically.
Yeah, well, he's basically like, well, I need to find Chloe. Chloe's in here. I need to go save her, and you're like, okay, cool. You do that, Tatler, and he runs off pretty much immediately.
Is he technically correct now that I think about it?
Well, yeah, because there's something to be said. Yeah, Chloe does appear as kind of a floating half torso with wings.
Yeah.
Right?
And she's less of a hallucination than anything that Noon is experiencing.
It's somewhat implied that she's something else that is telling him she is Chloe.
Ah, I see.
Also, this brings up a good point. So you know how your personalities are meant to be the evil versions of you, in a way.
Hmm.
I think
I noticed
later
that
on,
you,
I'm going to cut you off. I think later on they're all associated with something bad that has happened to you.
yeah, but like it's all you ever do in that game. Your personalities is help people.
Yeah, I think it might be sort of a sign that your traumas and the bad things that happen in the past define you and help build you up to be a more effective person.
I mean, not just that, but in terms of oh no, I lost my train of thought. I was in terms of you saying how you help people with them. There's a part later on where they the three of them start conversing together without you. I think it's when you're playing as Spacer in one of the later areas, and he stops and says, "All right, lads, what are we thinking about this?" And they all have a little conversation, as though it implies that they also help each other as well as just other people.
Yeah, and so should we just start talking about like the concept of alter egos and personalities? Because this is the first, because we don't actually get fully into sort of alternate personalities at this point, do we? Because Noon is seeing stuff, but then he dies, and we sort of move on. We don't get fully into.
I think we should note that Noon doesn't die.
Oh yes, true. Sorry, I'm a misfit. Fate worse than death.
Yeah, I mean, both him and Tatler essentially undergo some body horror later on, right?
Mm.
But yeah, should we talk? Okay, well, should we mention? We've talked a bit about the split personalities, but I guess we haven't talked about the thematic elements of them. So, do you want to kick us off, Rav?
Yeah, so I think I find it just nothing. So from the beginning, you have multiple personalities, but I think it's only in the second half that the alternate personality stuff truly sort of like expands and sort of becomes the driving force of this. And actually find out that in the colony, everyone has an alternate
Mm.
personality. Some characters even are the alternative
Yeah.
personality. We'll leave that till
Indeed.
later for the new listeners. But yeah, but I think I find now we'll just say like my interpretation of Laika by the very end is that each of his alternative personalities are very much a part of him and are sort of a different element of his personality that is dealt with a different bit, but it does feel like at the end he realizes he could be a stronger person with all of them and to actually incorporate all of these elements. And I think the game is very much about, and I think we'll talk about whether or not some people deserve redemption and all of that stuff, but given the quality of crimes that have been committed by some of these characters. But the game at the end of the day does talk about accepting yourself and being yourself and sort of incorporating these different parts of you because you will be stronger for it rather than hiding it, because when you try and be something you're not, sometimes you literally melt into bubbles and you die. And I think
No,
it
you
is very,
can't make
and
me not be a paedophile. No.
yeah, so that's crime one. We've got eating dead and well, I think actually no, eating dead animals is just what we all do.
Exhuming
Yes.
and eating buried animals.
Yeah. Should we actually just go around the table and say what the worst crime you think that was committed by one of these characters? I'm gonna go with multiple twin
I
infanticide.
think that's the one. I think that's the one, right? I don't think it gets worse.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, and buried alive, might
Yeah,
I
especially
add.
since the justification for it is very flimsy. What Little gets up to.
Yeah, he was the guy who had the two. He had the other
I
personality
know
as well.
Little and his alternate one, who was the religious guy, but I don't remember their backstory.
Yeah, so I think the idea is that the religious personality was something which Little developed as a coping mechanism for his guilt over the fact that he used to, as Raph was saying, serially murder twins in the colony.
twin children.
Yes.
Yeah, to be exact.
Going on about like the awful things they did. Did you guys get the opinion that Red might have been a pedophile?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's practically confirmed.
Because it never truly stated it. It just kept on going on about the face thing, and I was like,
Yeah.
but it just keeps on going on about this face thing. But you are implying
Yeah,
this,
like,
aren't you?
is he dolling him up so that he can get increased satisfaction from raping him, essentially?
It's not. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, I was going to say because he talks about how he had a lot of people, other characters mentioned how he had this other Uncle Bubbles character that sounded as though they abused him, and that's obviously something that happens. That's like a double. I don't know if it's a recurring theme, but I've heard a lot in terms of like child abuse, in terms of like often abusers are abused,
Mhm.
Yeah.
and that adds kind of further backing to that particular.
Well, I think cycling round back to what Raf said about, not being true to yourself and then literally turning into bubbles. I think Red is an interesting case because it's more that he succumbs to the mental anguish of being abused and perhaps, which I think is perfectly fair. I think it's more the fact that he, in order to cope with his own abuse, he chose to abuse himself. And that's why the guilt eventually, turns him into Bubbles, which is the really horrific implication that his abuser would bathe him, right? So he was squeaky clean.
Yeah.
And I know, I found all that stuff really horrible. Like, really, like, deeply uncomfortable, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's the second half of the game where you really start seeing like, oh, this is this person's fucked up backstory, and this is this person's really deep trauma. And I think sort of, and this is why I like to say this game is utterly uncommercial. It's because you have multiple paedophiles, multiple abusive parents, and it really does go into sort of like these dark subject matters, and like, yeah, this is a hard 18.
I don't think it's even just that. I think it's a lot. I'm muting that notification. But in terms of like,
Hold on, wait. Before we get a little bit distracted here, should we move on with the story a bit?
yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we've gone through.
Talked about Tatler's wife or lover.
Yeah, we talked about Chloe. Yeah, unfortunately, I think this is where. Well, I enjoyed it, but I think unfortunately for us, from explaining the plot route, this is where things get so odd and so disconnected that it's quite hard to form a central path to follow. I'd say this is the point where the game kind of, because the thing we're introduced into here is the scriptures, Galil, the Black Rider.
So the Black Rider appears.
I think you see the Black Rider right after you exit.
As you're leaving the village. I think you're first introduced to the concept of the Black Rider by the medicine men. They talk to you about how in the Bible, there's this Black Rider that comes along. He's like, he embodies death and he helps end the world when all the 7 trumpets blow in Revelations. But then, as you're leaving Valley Memorially, you see him, I think, in the sky flying overhead. There's a pre-rendered cutscene of him. I say he looks fucking fantastic.
He's just like a pitch black rocket ship type thing, isn't he?
Yeah, but he's also like, he's got this kind of like almost Buddha-like face.
He looks like Ansem at the end of Kingdom Hearts 1.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, but no, it does look cool, and it was a very good way of taking something from a biblical context with an established look and twisting it to fit this retro future aesthetic. Yeah, it was very well done.
So let's break this down so it's easier to understand at this point. So Valis Memorius is on fire, and now we do have to get into talking about Neo Universal Man and Universal Man.
Oh my god.
And the big fella frozen in ice.
Iceman, yes.
Universal Man.
But
Universal Man.
Let's do it step by step to make it easier, and let's simplify it if we can, because there's too much.
Let's summarize 5 hours of gameplay into what the actual
there is too much to talk about here. Basically, you leave Valis Memorius, and this is when the medicine men become really important, and the whole crux of the game shifts from finding your crewmates to finding Galil, who seems to be the focal point of everything that's going on. The evil mind, the strange happenings, all of it seems to be, to an extent, traceable back to Galil's influence on the penal colony.
You see the Dark Rider and the Medicine Men, and the Medicine Men have already told you this Dark Rider, or in the Bible, this rider was what brought death upon the world at the end of everything. And you see this Dark Rider, and I don't remember if it's you see Galil or they tell you, but somebody tells you in some way that Galil is accelerating the process of this Dark Rider, which is implied to have a similar role on Mars, that it's going to destroy all life and slash destroy all life slash rebirth the planet.
Yes, it's a bit. I think we should talk about what we perceive to be Galil's main goal at this point in time, which seems his goal is to become a perfectly good being, right? In the dichotomy between good and evil,
that's
you get. Go on, Ben. No, go on.
I was just going to say that's where I think that's where the theme of the game kind of deviates, because you start with this idea of the face and the soul and identity, and you have multiple identities, and other characters have multiple identities. But then we go from identities being different aspects of a personality in multiple, like examples, if existence of Laika and his 3 personalities, we shift to the other style of personality where they're more, instead of being different aspects of a whole, they appear more as opposites. And Galil's goal kind of ties in with this, because I don't know if it's implied that he has any other personalities, but his goal appears to be to remove an aspect of himself, because he sees one of his sides as good and the other one as pure evil. And this is I think the transition between the personality, I said, between being multiple parts of a whole to being 2 contrasting sides, whereas you and some other characters might have multiple, but later on when you introduce the villagers' personalities, they all seem to strictly have 2, which are often opposites explicitly of each other. And there's much more of a binary.
Yeah. And it seemed like Galil's idea of becoming a perfectly good entity was removing these alternate aspects, or these alternate personalities from yourself, so that you've got very little to your character and to your psyche.
And I suppose if you want to be cute about it as well, you can really you can really explain Galil's motive as a, classic anime villain, media villain.
It felt very Japanese.
Yeah, if nobody is good, then we destroy everything, and then everybody is good because nobody is alive anymore, right? And then rebuilding the world in his perfect image.
Yeah, although I do think it's a little bit more justified than in some anime, in some anime and JRPG type things, because Mars is it's a fucked up, uninhabitable place.
It's very sick.
Yeah,
right? It's
Should we discuss that? Because so I'm just going to mention the Dubliners. But there's a strong line of literature that talks about places as bad places.
Yeah.
And is it because of the place, or is it because of the people? And that's the constant
I think in
question.
terms of Mars, it's in this game it's almost both, because the planet Mars is objectively bad because of the corrupting influence of the evil mind, but the evil mind itself is a manifestation of the ill will of the Martians, so it goes back to people as well.
Yeah, and I think that again that speaks to one of the themes of this game, is that the past is an anchor which brings people down.
Yeah.
And Mars actually threatens to destroy Earth by the end of the game. Sort of that negative energy is only sort of growing, and I find it interesting that sort of, do they truly explain what's going on with the Martians and whether the problem was solved?
I think that's the best part of the game, is the unknowable Martian element.
Yeah.
Because I think there's an implication as well that, is Evil Mind really the ill will of the Martians? or is it just some sort of is it something else entirely? Is it some sort? Is that the only way that people can understand what it is?
But then you get the stones towards the end, which are described by several characters as the goodwill of the Martians, which is used to cancel them out.
And they're related to the scriptures, which I think we need to talk about.
Do we have to?
We need to define what the scriptures are
I think
and why they need to be collected.
That becomes the crux of the second half of the game. Once you see that Galil's doing this, and you go back to the Medicine Men, and they tell you about the Dark Rider. I think you're right, because you see the Dark Rider first, and you're like, what the fuck is that?
Yeah.
And then you go back to them, either with or without April, and then they tell you about that and the biblical aspect of it, and they tell you what Galil's goal is, and then they tell you about the prophecies, which is the second narrative half of the game.
Yeah, and so, I mean, can anyone help me define what the scriptures actually were and why we were collecting them?
Absolutely not. No.
Okay, so I think the idea with the scriptures is, from an assumptive point of view, is that it is some sort of not forbidden, but mystical knowledge that will help counteract whatever Galil is doing, right? And these scriptures have been
connected to the old Martians, or
something like that. Because I think along with the scriptures come the stones that you were talking about, Ben, which is like the physical manifestation of the Martians' goodwill, which is funny because you only ever hear about the Martians' bad will, but obviously, in a game that's all about dichotomies and reflections of things, there has to be good with evil, so there must have been goodwill.
Lads, just play Celeste, yeah.
All right, no, that's getting cut. That's getting cut from the final. We're getting banned from the podcast. We won't be having that. We'll be having changing topics like that. But anyway, these scriptures are attached to different characters, and essentially they're locked behind boss fights, and in a way, I guess, using Laika's multiple personalities to help certain characters come to terms with things. Do you think that's a fair reading of some of these?
Yeah. It's definitely what happens with Little.
A conclusion to their personal arc.
Yeah, and it's what happens with Herod as well, right?
Yeah.
To an extent. Although the whole Herod thing is really more of a Yolanda arc towards the end of the game. But yeah, there's the whole thing with Little collecting the scriptures, and that's kind of the goal, and that's kind of what happens throughout most of the second half of the game. Now, the other thing that we need to cover and talk about is, and yeah, this is the hardest thing to talk about, is Universal Man and Neo Universal Man and Rock Rebirth.
Yeah, who are almost like begging you to not take them seriously as soon as they give you their names.
Isn't the one in the cave just called Death, I think?
I thought that was Neo Universal Man, because
I thought that there was Iceman, there was Universal Man, and then when they combine, they become Neo Universal Man.
They become Neo Universal Man. Okay, my bad. Yeah, that does make more sense. But I think we should define firstly that Universal Man is kind of a prophet, right? He's a hero and a prophet, and originally he is kind of the figure that is set up to fight Galil.
Yeah,
he was the. I don't know if it was the case that he produced the prophecies, but he's definitely the one that originally collected the prophecies and was the one responsible for bringing them into the common knowledge of the current populace.
Because am I right in thinking
he was exiled for it?
Yeah, because it's initially the conceit is that the prophecies were written by a dude named Jeremiah, but towards the end of the story, it's kind of revealed that Jeremiah probably was not a person and did not exist in that sense.
And I think it would probably be helpful to define here what the game means by Universal Man, or to at least think about other kind of man adjacent things. I'm talking about Renaissance Man, Vitruvian Man. What does Universal Man embody? He's supposed to embody almost perfection, right? In a way that Galil is also trying to obtain. But it's more of a balanced perfection, because he has Iceman as well, and he has his other half that he eventually combines with. But I think the whole idea of Universal Man is that he's supposed to embody the perfect balance of a human being, right? He's not pure good.
Yeah.
He's not pure evil, but he is, he's learned. I mean, if we take, for example, if we take Vitruvian Man and Renaissance Man as examples, these are people who are well-rounded. Vitruvian Man, is the the sketch, the
Yeah.
sketch of the man kind of supine with his arms out and his legs out, and he's perfection. Not perfection, but he is the balance by which to judge other men.
And this game is very much about what kind of people you should be. But can I ask then, did you look up to Universal Man? Was it clear? Because
I think that's when his most interesting characteristics come about, is that he is, through his unknowability, because there is no such thing as a perfectly balanced man, he is not much of a character.
He becomes a helper as opposed to an actual direct agent of the story.
Yeah, he's there in the background. He speaks essentially in riddles for the most part, or at least, I mean, most of the game could be argued that it speaks in riddles, but he in particular, doesn't make much sense. And then you've got the whole Rock Rebirth and forming the two together. And I'll be honest, I don't really remember what the result of the Rock Rebirth was. His fusing with Iceman. I think maybe it reveals one of the scriptures.
yeah, I have to say, by this point in the game, I was clocked
Yeah,
out.
it got a bit much to me towards the end when it felt like it was sort of a flurry of themes, none of which really got the attention that they needed to become fully comprehensible by that stage. But I mean, I thought, based on what the Venusian obsessed dudes were saying about Rock Rebirth, I thought it was sort of a theory for the birth of planets, and that perhaps the end game for Galil and maybe also for Universal Man was to either completely rebirth Mars from scratch or birth a new planet via Rock Rebirth.
That's a very good point. I also think it's worth noting that Rock Rebirth, in essence, brings into question what Mars is. Because if Mars is evil, if it has become evil, then surely Rock Rebirth would not suit the union of Iceman and Universal Man.
Yeah.
Like, I think it brings into question what you were bringing up earlier, Raph, about can places be evil? I think Laika says probably not. Right? Like, Mars itself is not an evil entity, but there is certainly evil things afoot during it. So that's kind of the second half of the game. I don't think we should go into detail for each scripture or each character at this point. But is there any that people maybe want to highlight specifically kind of during this period? I think it's probably worth talking about Face, the plastic surgery element. I think that's one of the more interesting.
Yeah, because we have basically explained the end of the game, haven't we now?
We didn't explain the conclusion, but up until that point, yeah. I just remembered, this discussion has written characters that get forgotten about and which ones you remember. I've just remembered that I don't know if this happened to anybody else, but there's that guy that is really rude to you at the bar, and he's effectively a misogynist, and he beats you up at one point, and then I think he's never seen again. I don't remember what happened to him after that.
Smokey, right?
Yes,
Smokey?
yes.
Yeah, he beats the shit out of you, and then you never see him again.
It's kind of used as a way to start to hint at Ernest's backstory, where they're like, oh, look, Ernest, you were too weak to protect Laika. But then it kind of isn't. I guess maybe that's further indication of the game being rushed and or truncated.
Yeah, that is definitely one of the odder parts of the game.
Yeah. And just to complain about the gameplay at this point, is that in the second half of the game, it does feel like you walk up and down the colony.
You're just looking for to activate the right flag by entering the right area or speaking to the right guy.
And also I also did multiple dream sequences in a row, because you can go to bed and press the button, and I just went to bed 3 times in a row.
I did it for all of them up. I was really relieved when you get to the end and it doesn't actually have all 12 months for you. I think it has like 7 or 8 of them. I was like, oh, thank God, I couldn't keep on doing that.
Yeah, there is a lot of flag checking at this point, right? Do things in the correct order to progress, and I think a couple of people got hung up on that or got lost or thought the game was bugged out because of that, right?
Yeah, there was certainly a couple of occasions where because this is a game that no one's played, there are no explicit walkthroughs, so I just had to look up a long play and be like, all right, what did this person do to progress the story, and then follow that.
Yeah, so that's, I guess maybe, I think we should talk about the plastic surgery, but maybe to kick us off, I, I want to talk about my favorite thing, and that is the what happens to Noon and Tatler and the extreme body horror.
Well, I think it's the intriguing part of that is, unlike a lot of, I don't know, it's not really addressed. The way the game progresses, you leave after having a sort of very unsuccessful like, obviously the first goal is recover your crew, and maybe from there you can start. But then you fail to do that, and not only that, the game immediately puts you on the next arc in these prophecies and stopping Galil, and I don't know if it's the fact that you come back to them later as part of looking for the prophecies, and it's almost as though kind of you've been the game reminds you that you failed at that by making them as after you leave them there, that you come back and they're in an even worse state than where you left them.
It's a very disturbing way to think
Yeah.
about it, right? Because, for example, what happens to Noon? So you hear rumblings. Yeah, it's funny, but it's absolutely horrible. You hear rumblings, essentially, in the colony, don't you, that Noon has achieved perfect goodness, right? He's a perfectly good being. And I don't know about you guys, but when I read that, I was like, oh, that's not
Yeah,
fucking
that's
good.
immediately sinister.
Yeah, that's really bad. And I don't know. Do you have to go back to the ship to find him? Did anyone miss him?
It felt to me like I'd stumbled upon like
Yeah, it felt to me like I stumbled across him as well.
At the end, you need all the rocks.
Yeah.
And it was quite interesting because one of the first mechanics you're introduced to is that there are items embedded in walls as sparkles.
Oh, yeah.
And only Ernest can pick them out because he's the only one strong enough. And one of the things I remembered straight away was when you leave the ship, there's a twinkling rock in the wall. And so I went straight back there as soon as I found out about that with Ernest.
Same.
And I
Yeah, and you can't do it. He refuses to, right?
No, if you do it in like the second half, you pick it out and there's one of the stones.
You can get it very early. It can be the first stone you get.
Yeah, I think it was the first stone I got.
I'm pretty sure as soon as I became Ernest, I went back to pick out the stone. But, oh no, I remember what happened. You can't approach the ship at that stage because there's like a miasma of evil mind. Yeah, which is quite annoying. But yeah, as soon as you can reach that area, he does take it out. Yeah.
And so the interesting thing about that is that obviously I got like right to the final hour. My game crashed, and I had to cover a let's play for the last half hour. Sorry, but in doing so, the let's player didn't know that, and obviously the part of the end where you've been through all the dream sequences and you get all the stones one at a time, except for the white stone, and he had a whole like hour where he was wandering about aimlessly trying to work out where the last stone was.
Oof.
And then it eventually cut with him like cutting the screen saying, oh, it was the white stone was by the rocket.
It's interesting that people missed it.
Yeah, like it.
No. I missed it.
Oh, you missed it, did you? Come on.
Yeah, because I think I played the game in like really weird segments where I played like the first sort of 30 minutes one day, and then I played like an hour another day, and I played 30 minutes another day. So it's why I'm not really saying much because I can barely remember most of the story because it's just so disconnected. I wrote random things down, but I was just like, I'm assuming you guys will carry it, and you are. But like I missed it because I just completely walked past it because I swear to God you don't see it sparkle like as Laika in the gameplay apart from that.
From what I remember, when you were in that area the first time, they kind of draw attention to it, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, they do.
I could not remember. I just remember like walking because I was trying to figure out okay, what is this game actually about?
I guess it's.
Sorry, just before we go a bit further on the tangent, I just wanted to mention that because I think the reason Noon is where he is in that ship is so that you find him when you go back to get that white stone. I think that's why he's put there.
That's interesting because I want to know if I want to know if that trigger is missable. Essentially,
It's so hard to know what is and isn't a flag you have to activate to progress.
Hold on. So what happened to Noon? Because I think I've missed this.
let me get to it. So when you go back into the rocket, basically this is in the last couple of hours of the game. Essentially, you go into the rocket, you go up into the pilot area. Essentially, the game cuts, and there's a tiny glass bottle on the floor, and Noon is in it, but he's spaghettified, like his neck is elongated, and he's got like this serene look on his face, but he's basically, I don't know, like he's been body horrored, right?
There's a line of dialogue, right, where as you nothing. He doesn't say anything. He's just in this little jar. And as you stand up, I don't know if it's. I think maybe I was Yolanda at the time, but I do remember what the character I was as at the time said. I might be Phoenix. States they say, this doesn't look like. As you stand up and like leave it behind, they say this doesn't look like. This seems like a pretty bad thing to be. If it's something along the lines of, this isn't what this seems pretty crap for something that
I
should
think
be
it's the
perfect
moment
good.
that drives home the message in no uncertain terms. That to be free of evil is basically to cut yourself off from all outside influence, from everything, which is obviously potentially a fate worse than death.
I think the spaghettification, the body horror of it, is the implication that in order to do that, you must squeeze yourself into the tightest space possible, right? You must mangle
Right.
yourself in order to fit the confines of being a perfectly good being, which is really horrible when you think about it. And it's interesting. I think we should go on. Come on.
Yeah, sorry. Phoenix said becoming a good person should lead to a happier ending than this. At least that's what I'd want.
Yes, that was the line. Yeah.
Yeah, and we will get onto Phoenix as well, but talking about Tatler as well, I think Tatler's more overt and you do see him, but I also think that, probably he's not actually called Tatler anymore once you rediscover him, right? He is the signpost in
Yes.
the Mushroom Village,
Yes.
which is the altered state of the mining village, which happens for reasons unknown, pretty much. There probably is a reason, I cannot remember it.
I was going to say, I was again going back to the idea that you left them there. I think it's the implication. It's just a sort of, although it's a weird perhaps way of doing it, but it's implied as a further sort of state of decay beyond just burning. As they've started to go crazy now.
No, I think the areas where they start talking about hallucinations, I feel they explicitly say that. I feel that Chloe explicitly says it's hallucination, and to be honest, I quite liked that they showed the nice version second.
Is it a nice version though? It's
Like it's
horrendous.
colourful. Like nothing. All these places are. Yeah, actually, no. Like most of these places are horrible, but
I'd say it's worse than the Burning Village. I think it's worse to have
the facade you think is worse.
like what's happened to Tatler. He's this horrible bird. He's like a huge head with bird legs and like spinning clock eyes. It's horrible.
Yeah, but for me, I think the area specifically and maybe I was desensitized by the big bird head thing creature. Maybe I should have been more horrified by that. But it's how I imagine these people actually lived. And so it's how I imagine they've seen the world for this long, long period of time while you've been away. Because I can imagine these people living like this in a way that sort of, I know it is intrinsically illogical to live in like the houses with one wall, and they must have been seeing something different for it to have made sense. And maybe that was sort of how I think they were seeing the world, that it wasn't so horrible to them.
Yeah, I was going to say the way I saw it was that particular area of Mars, Valoris Memore or whatever it was called, kind of existed to create a reality that would entrap certain people. So it seemed like when you first go there and it's all these houses with only one wall actually existing, it seemed like the entire setup was built to entrap Noon by creating a reality that sort of fed into his desire to regress into childhood and be in his childhood home with his mother, who he has this sort of twisted reliance on. And then in some other way that I wasn't quite so certain of, it seemed like the town turning into this weird fantasy mushroom type place was doing the same thing but for Tatler. So it seemed like Tatler was in the same area of the map that the house that you found Noon in was at. So I thought that was probably quite significant. And it also seemed like you find I forget her name, but you find Tatler's
Chloe.
yeah, you find her there. So it seemed like it might have been the area creating a fairy tale scenario where he can be with her, and that was what was going to keep him there forever.
I was going to just interject though. You do also you fight Chloe as a boss fight in the first burning section of the town.
Oh, I forgot about
Yeah.
that.
Well, I think you don't fight her directly, do you? You fight like a robot that's possessed her, or she's possessed.
Or no, I think there's a fire spirit where the fire's like trapped her.
I mean, I think one of the interesting questions to pose here might be if Noon became a perfectly good being, then what did Tatler become in this situation? What is the significance of him being this weird signpost creature? Is it.
I
Go on, Rat.
I think it's the guilt. I think it's the being held back by something in the past.
Splitting himself in too many directions, sort of thing. You know, pointing at too many things at once, because he's a clock as well, in some essence. You know, I think there's a lot to be said at time running out, splitting yourself off in too many different paths, but also, you know, he's sedentary as a signpost as well. He cannot move from that spot. But also maybe that's because Chloe, at least in this twisted reality, is safe, right? She has a little place that she floats about. I must admit, though, yeah, I don't really get the significance of Chloe as a cat. Like, I get her point within Tatler's story. I don't really get the point of her design.
She's
No.
she's a whole separate thing. I think this was another thing. Maybe it was cut, but it feels like she was going to be a separate character that wasn't actually Chloe, but fulfilled that role for Tatler and kind of fell back in with the false hallucinations.
Yeah,
Isn't this the only character that's technically dead? This is maybe it's a character that's being manifested from his mind, and thus whatever the evil mind is doing is making this weird thing where maybe all he's remembering is her face.
yeah.
And that's why the bottom half is just a robot.
Yeah,
Just it doesn't really
that's
matter.
a good way of thinking of it. Yeah.
I'd like to bring up at this point, especially in relation to Chloe and Tatler's story, I think we should talk at some point about influences in sci-fi media. But I think specifically that Tatler and Chloe's relationship and that whole thing in general is very much Tarkovsky's Solaris.
Pray tell, can you give us a summary of this?
Absolutely. So Solaris is similar in a few ways, but it's essentially about a spaceship crew who experience hallucinations, right? It's a very somber film, and it's not a horror film. You know, it's definitely got psychological elements to it. But Tarkovsky was very interested through his filmmaking, you know, in exploring quite lofty themes. But the whole thing with Tatler and Chloe and the relation to Solaris is that the main crux of Solaris is that the captain of the ship, his wife has been dead for 10 years. One morning he wakes up on the spaceship and she's there with him, sitting on the edge of his bed. She doesn't know how she got there, but she's there with him. Everyone can see her. She's there. She's back. And it's dealing with those kind of that grief and those feelings surrounding having somebody who is so important to you suddenly appear back in your life. And I think that happens to an extent with Tatler and Chloe. It's not explored in that kind of extremely nuanced way like it is in Solaris, but I think there is inspiration there from the themes and ideas that Solaris explores. And I think we should also probably mention 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is, you know, again, a hugely influential piece of sci-fi media that Laika clearly, you know, takes quite a lot from ideas of, you know, rebirth, unknowable things, and obviously all the Christianity and biblical references as well. But yeah, that's my film tangent anyway. Worth thinking about.
Also, one thing I will say is that so Noon sort of Evil Mind affects him like this, and Evil Mind affects Tatler. But Evil Mind doesn't really affect April that much, nor does it affect your own character. And I think for April, I just assumed that she didn't really have any evil inside of her to like sort of manifest these things. She kind of stayed normal throughout.
Yeah, you get the explanation at the end where she's a mirror spirit.
Yeah.
So
I was just going to say that I think the main character splitting his personalities into three, well, arguably four, basically meant the evil mind could never really corrupt him that much because
Yeah.
it just kept on. He kept on
didn't have
splitting into
he
someone
didn't
else,
have
and
the
then
binary that everybody else had,
Mm.
where they were split. He was already
he was safe from splitting his mind
because
up
it was
like
already
this.
split. Yeah. I was going to say with April, I believe from what I interpreted, we have the reverse, where you meet April and then you find out later that she's actually somebody else's half that died, or at the very least isn't around anymore, and she's already again, part of the reason it doesn't affect her so much is because instead of her being a person that's shattered into bits, she's already a bit, and it's more a case of with her reuniting with the fact that the other bit basically, in that she is a different personality of a woman who existed previously,
Yeah,
who and/or was her mother.
My interpretation of that was that she was just that woman's reflection, and that when she was talking about things like selfish love, what she was talking about was the woman being very vain about her appearance, spending all her time in front of her mirror, like making herself look as good as she could. And so April felt like she was being used in that sense as the person on the other side of the mirror, and eventually she got sick of it and took autonomy from the person who was the original person.
yeah. I was quite worried actually because this is kind of like the final third of the game that like April was some like godlike figure, and I was kind of worried like, oh no, please don't have the mythical, don't have the one female teammate be a mythical sort of godlike creature that's doing everything, and it didn't
No.
end up turning like that, thankfully.
Mm.
But it was definitely sort of a no, I think they by the end of it they wrapped it up nicely and did sort of explain like, okay, you're another sort of aspect of personality, even though clearly you're not. There's no analogy to you in the real world. You are just sort of half. Well, that's the thing. They sort of imply she's half a person, but she feels very much like the most sensible full person to you and the team that you can like
Yeah,
have
absolutely.
conversations with that is interested. But at the end of the day, sort of, I guess you'd say that reality stops her from existing. She's not allowed to exist without her alter ego, and I think that's sort of a
Should we
shame.
talk about April's mother in relation to this? Because that's one of the big key factors. Yeah, because we mentioned earlier about how with Nunes' mother, with Tatler, it's Chloe, his lover. But April's mother is a very important figure as well, right? In kind of her hallucinatory sequences.
I've honestly forgotten how this book.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was just saying there is what I thought of April's mother. That I suspected that the use of the term mother was a bit loose, and that rather than being April's mother, she was just sort of the original person that April was, and April was her reflection in the
There
mirror.
was a lot of talk about how
Mm.
good that room was and how it was a very pretty, perfect little room.
Yeah, well, I think what I read at least it was that in a similar way to Noon's relationship, the mother character in April's life was, less violent but vapid, right? Impossible to form an emotional connection with. April was a perfect, pretty little girl.
Yeah, you could see it as the mother being an excellent mother, but only for the sake of being seen by others as an excellent mother, rather than because she actually loves April.
Absolutely, and I think that recontextualizes her relationship with Agatha as well, the fortune teller, who
Mm.
kind of almost has a maternal role to the whole penal colony, and you see April with her a lot as well. I think there's something to be said there about Agatha's relationship with April and the role of a mother, within society, I guess, within human life. What does a mother provide,
Mm.
you know? And is in some cases, taking it back to Tatler, is Chloe too much of a mother figure for him?
Yeah, I was going to bring this up at some point, that it seemed odd to me that of the four crew members, three of them have traumas very close, well, basically sort of rooted in their relationships with their mothers, and then there's Tatler, whose trauma is based on another female person, but not explicitly a mother figure. It's more likely to be a romantic
Ooh,
partner.
well, it could be.
Well, yeah, I was thinking, yeah, is there a maternal aspect to their relationship? Could it have been
Yeah,
incestuous, or was it just more sort of, because you can get romantic relationships that kind of feel like you're relying on the other person as a parent figure.
I won't put it past this game for sure to have
Yeah.
that sort of implication in there somewhere. I do realize that we're approaching 2 hours now, so I think maybe we should attempt.
Do you want to hit the last key points of the story then? Like I was thinking, we haven't talked much about Phoenix.
Yeah, that's true. We definitely got to cover Phoenix.
Fair enough. Just rush to the end of the story,
Okay,
Patrick.
so I think we'll hit Phoenix next, but again, I need you guys to help me with this because this is where the game is at its most confusing, right?
This is where I started watching somebody else play the game.
So, okay, to sum it up and not to get too deep into things, we find out that Laika as a personality, Laika, the Nov character, essentially, that you named throughout the game, is basically a relatively new personality. We were going to talk about the ego and the id. They are the id, right? They are a new creation from Laika to help deal with the traumatic childhood that they had, abusive stepfather, abusive stepbrother, and their mother committing suicide, essentially, right?
While pregnant.
While pregnant.
Yes.
Yeah, we can't forget that. That's just the icing on the cake, right? But they form those personalities, and those personalities were all part of their original key personality.
I do remember. So Ernest was something that he created because that was to protect the mother, which he failed at doing. Yolanda was there. Yolanda was there to protect his little sister, who was still inside his mother when that happened, the suicide. But Spacer, they have no idea. He came from a book.
I believe Spacer was the kind of rebound of that, where Spacer was kind of this. They always refer to him as the little cosmonaut. Like he was the one that kind of came out at the end of that, where it was like, I mean, I think his emergent factor was when involving the step brother, where I think he was the one that emerged in order to frame the step brother for arson.
Right.
Yes.
And later after that, he sort of takes a commanding role, I think, in that's kind of his thing, is taking charge and being organized.
Exactly. They say on a couple of occasions that he's the one who kind of sort of leads or at least guides the whole entourage of Laika and their split personalities and gives them a single unifying direction.
Particularly when he leans in and goes, "All right, lads, let's have a conversation," and they will answer him.
He is always the one that instigates that, isn't he?
Well, you always read him as the driving force, right? He's the reason that Laika became a cosmonaut.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think there's something there that experiencing that kind of abuse and that kind of tragedy, your mind has to focus on something, right, to get you through it. And in this case, it's the book, it's the rocket. Spacer emerged to ensure that essentially part of Laika's fractured personality could be distracted from what was going on around them, because it doesn't really have, like you said, that emotional connection that Yolanda and Ernest do to Laika's family. Is very much, this is something for my own personal gain that's not related to somebody else. And I suppose through that, then we should talk about Phoenix, which is, can anyone explain what Phoenix is?
So Phoenix is an alternative sort of. He's not an alternative personality. He's an alternative spirit that gets put onto.
Wait, Ben, you speak and then I'll speak.
I'll go first, because I had two interpretations. The first one, which is what I believed it to be, which is from what I read when I played the game, was that Phoenix was a secret fourth one that was around initially. I don't remember what the instigating event was for him, but he was around initially, but he didn't say anything, and he'd only just been. He was very much an embryo, and he didn't have proper form. He watched everything happen, but didn't do anything, and he only got properly given form later on. But what you mentioned later may have changed me, because I initially thought, when you said that Laika, I don't know the science behind the id in the super id and the ego, but in terms of how you mentioned that Laika was quote unquote not the original, could it perhaps be that Laika was what remains and Phoenix was the original pre-shattering?
Yeah, that could be it.
That's how I read it. I read it as Phoenix was actually the original personality, and Laika is just the slate that was created in order to bear this abuse. I mean, the reason I mention that, and my perspective might be coloured here, not a spoiler, but there are still very, very similar thematic elements explored in Xenogears. Very, very similar, about the ego and the id and the fracturing of personalities. And through that game's reading of the ego and the id, it seemed to me that Laika was a new creation to bear psychological burdens, and that Phoenix was some sort of maybe original or dormant personality that existed beforehand.
So one thing that I might have thought, because so honestly, I feel like I've taken this in a completely different direction from all of you, because I always do this with every game. I will just randomly think of something else. Then yeah, that's fair. That's right. I still think like this entire game is in his mind. I think that he is on an operating table, and they're trying to remove the tumor in his head, and that tumor is Phoenix. That, but the thing is that is something that is also in his childhood. So it's impossible to really know because the game isn't really fully defined. You probably are all right in what you're thinking, but that's what I thought initially. I thought that Phoenix was the tumor in his head, that he has a brain tumor.
They cut to him being like a tumor in his head. Yeah,
There is a heavy implication for that, yeah.
Because the captain is the captain and the doctor are exactly the same.
The character that for the whole of the story we're led to believe is the Laika's captain on a space mission is actually his doctor, who's helping him with this tumor, right?
and the way he cuts into you through messages like from afar.
Yeah, and it's because you're also when you're under in a surgery, you do hear things.
Yeah.
So perhaps these things you're hearing are influencing what
know
he's
that.
thinking of
I
in his
didn't
head.
need to know
Because
that.
perhaps perhaps these these personalities, these three personalities, do actually exist, and the fourth one also exists because of this brain tumor. Or possibly it could be that the three personalities are coming from the doctors working on him. Because there's that one scene where you're technically looking up and they are looking down at you with the lights.
I think that is an incredibly fair interpretation of the game and very accurate. My problem with that is if that is the intended interpretation of the game, I'm going to be pissed, because there is nothing worse than having Super Mario Brothers 2.
Yeah.
Patrick, what do you think of the scene where they're sort of like blitzing down the school corridor or the hospital corridor, which looks live action?
I think it's worth noting.
Honestly,
sorry, just to say really quickly, I think it is worth noting that scene occurs in the realm of nightmares.
Yeah.
Right? It occurs within Herod's realm, within with Agatha and the oxygen tanks. I think there is an implication in that scene that is what Laika's mind is trying to trick them into believing what is happening. It's making them question everything.
And of course, as we were saying very early on in this discussion, it's established at the beginning of the game that not all of the hallucinations that you might experience, or not all the memories that evil mind might bring up within you, are true.
Mm-hmm.
That's lazy writing.
What I will say as well is that it could also be a childhood memory of this is where he came from. Maybe you were never able to get rid of the brain tumor. Maybe they're like, damn, we can't get rid of this
Well,
out
they
of his
do say
head.
that,
Let's
don't
just
they?
leave
They
it
give
there.
up on the
What's it
operation
gonna
at the
do?
end.
Yeah, it's pretty
They were
much.
damaging
So it
too
could just be
much,
this is where he came from. This is where it came from. The fourth personality came from a brain tumor.
I thought that, like, in the most literal sense, the explanation of Phoenix's existence was that Phoenix was Laika's twin, who was originally developed in the womb with Laika, but eventually Phoenix regressed, did not become a full human being, and instead just kind of attached himself to Laika's brain as this tumor. And also, I thought it was suggested that the three other personalities, so Ernest, Spacer, and Yolanda, were part of the tumor as well. So they were rather than all four of them being part of Laika, the three split personalities were a part of Phoenix, and Phoenix was then a part of Laika.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It does it gets very muddled around this point in the game, right? And I think purposefully so.
Yeah, can you explain why Phoenix does what he does, though?
Yes, we've got to move on to that, right? Phoenix drives people crazy,
Yeah.
right? Is what the game tells you.
And that's why I struggled to understand how he could be part of Laika truly.
I think specifically it's that he makes people switch.
Yes, mechanically he makes people switch to their other personality, right? When you speak to them, but it's quantified within the game as driving people insane.
Yeah, well, don't they say that it's making people fully good? It's absorbing the evil out of them, and in doing so, you drive them insane. But it also seems like what you can extrapolate from that is that
You're bringing out the bad personality.
yeah,
Or the
exactly.
alternate.
Yeah, all of the personalities that you're presented with by all the people at the colonies are alternate personalities that they have developed that are the evil side of them. And then when you speak to them as Phoenix, you rip those personalities out of them and you make them the person that they were originally.
Before this goes on for way too long, do you want to rush to the end of the story still? Because we're talking about Phoenix now, aren't we? And what he did, and he's making people insane. But after that, because pretty much we get to the last hour and we get to just exposition after exposition after exposition, and then we get some
I found it
cutscenes.
especially lame that after about 4 hours of most of the gameplay just being walking back and forward through the town talking to people, the final dungeon, as it were, of the game is just a grey reverse version of the same colony as a dreamscape.
I liked that bit just to see. So this is the alternative. I spent enough fucking time in this place at sort of a basic reverse.
Yeah, now I'm in the same
of-
place, but it's flipped on its x-axis. Oh my god!
Well, let's wrap up and just say that through manifesting Phoenix, you gain access to the last scripture, right? And you have all of the scriptures in order to essentially face down Galil. Again, what do you need the stones as well, right? You need
Yeah, well, the stones are what ultimately defeat Galil, aren't they?
And collecting them the whole time.
Yeah, so and now I'm a bit foggy about what happens right at the end. I know what happens post credits, but essentially you go to face down Galil, right? Yeah.
and you win.
Well, you have a boss rush first, where you have to fight, essentially.
3 in a row.
I think
goddamn.
the first thing that Galil tries to do is he tries to bring the prophecy to completion by having him as as a pure good person and you as a pure evil person, with
I
your
think this
evil
is
being exemplified
interesting.
by all of your split
Just-
personalities, like
just to
joined
cut
together.
in.
Yeah, go on.
I was gonna say his view of what good and evil is contrasts with what everywhere else the good and evil is seen as a dichotomy or as like a split between things where the evil isn't necessarily bad, it's an alternate part of the whole. Whereas Galil, he views himself as not only does he want to be the perfect good, he wants to be a single. And he sees you as a multiple.
Mm.
And he knows you're a multiple, not just a binary, but like a polyamory. Not amory, but you know what I mean. In terms of like, you're several, not so you're like the ultimate antithesis to him in terms of that he's trying to be this singular perfect being, and you're the exact opposite in you're practically a collective of separate distinguishable aspects, and that's where he sees you. That's why perhaps that he sees you as the ultimate evil, because you're the ultimate antithesis to his existence.
Yeah, he is one
Yeah.
of the only characters who doesn't present any form of split personality, and that's very much down to that, isn't it?
No, it's an excellent point, and I don't know, Galil is kind of, unfortunately, despite how interesting that makes him sound, he's also kind of a non-entity.
Yeah.
Right? He's spoken about, and then he finally appears with the Black Rider, and you just kind of defeat him. Right? And and then there's, I suppose we should talk about what happens with April and Laika, and it starts snowing, right? Right at the end. And this, bringing it back to, did we discuss the relevance of Christmas?
Not really. There was that one room in the there was one room that was entirely Christmas themed on the planet.
Nothing happens
and
there, right? I don't remember going in there for any reason.
I couldn't find
The
anything there.
music track changes though, which is interesting. We should talk about the
It's a
music.
very
if we have time.
odd. It's a very odd location because you never need
That's
to
what
go
I
in
mean.
there for
There's no
anything.
point where I was asked to go in there.
Yeah, I mean, we were speaking about the relevance of Christmas, not just because of the Christian, symbology, and we talk about the relevance of Christmas insofar as maybe you want to take this, Raf, and talk about the idea of hope and joy juxtaposed with what is actually going on.
Yeah, so they established very early on that it is literally Christmas Day. And they also established relatively early on, or about midway, like the importance of Christmas to Laika specifically. Sort of, the cover of the game is a spaceship, and it looks like a toy spaceship. And you also find there's also a clip if you go back on yourself. But basically, what you have is sort of that Christmas was clearly quite important to Laika. It was a gift from
It's from his biological father, the spaceship.
yes. So it's even stronger than the link
Yeah.
to the past and
I think
sort of
the way to
nostalgic.
look at it, or the way I look at it, is that toy spaceship is like a strongest link to their their biological father, and so by extension, Christmas Day is the strongest link they have to their biological father.
Yeah, that link as well. And also, just to take it literally, space is far away. It's about escape. It's about a whole new world and sort of leaving. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to move to that town or that country. I'm going to leave the planet. So again, it talks about sort of Laika wanting something better, sort of hope to leave. And I also think just generally in society, Christmas is a good day. It's what you work towards. It's what you think. And then of course, there's that underbelly of you have to spend, like there's a belief you spend it with family, and people always don't have the best family relationship. There's that struggle on Christmas. And I do find it interesting that there's sort of like multiple references to Christmas throughout, sort of just in terms of like some rooms at Christmas, the music changes.
How you save as well, right? The helper dogs.
The little
that you save
canines.
at. Yeah, little Christmas hats.
Oh, I never noticed that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you sort of like try and wrap yourself up in this, but it doesn't save you. You don't you never call on the power of Christmas to use the power of Santa to fix things. But I think it's a memory which is always there, which you remember and you sort of lean upon to feel better. And I think it's it's a nice reminder of the traditions and the rituals that humans use.
That's a very good summary.
And yeah, the snow at the end is kind of almost, it represents finality, obviously, but also represents that somehow, if we're being optimistic about it, Laika has obtained some sort of Christmas, right? Some sort of perfect Christmas for themselves, a white Christmas.
It's worth mentioning, I think, that they do make it explicit. I don't know if everyone did this. I know me and Raf were discussing it briefly earlier on, but there's sort of an optional side quest, as it were, you can do where every time you sleep, you appear in a little dream and you get an item which represents a month. And then if you have Agatha read that month for you, she gives you a small bit of backstory that occurred from Laika's childhood in the year when he was living with his mother, but also his nasty stepfather and stepbrother.
Okay.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so yeah, I did get all of them, and it was a bit of a slog. But it does make clear that the month that Laika and his mother first moved in to live with Vladimir and Sergei was December. So
I see.
yeah, so
Yeah.
I think it kind of contrasts a bit that his fondest memory, or Laika's fondest memory, is of Christmas with his biological father, and probably one of his worst memories was that first Christmas where he just moved in with his horrible new family. And then at the end of this game, it seems like he gets to experience another perfect, serene Christmas.
Yeah, with April.
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
Also, speaking of those places
Yeah.
where you go to sleep, I had an odd feeling that it could also be seen as, like, I'm going back to my interpretation, but it could also be like a hospital, because usually, I don't know if any of you've been in a hospital for a very long time. I have, but usually there's like a bit where it's like, okay, it's now nighttime, please sleep or whatever. I believe that happens in Japan, but I'm not sure, because I know in Japan at around like after 5, it's like weird. Hospitals work like 9 till 5, and then they're just like, all right, no more visiting hours.
Yeah, it's
We're
a shame. I'm around
closed.
hospitals constantly because of my job, but never after sleeping hours.
Yeah, and so perhaps I know that like lights are turned off. I mean, well, I was last in the hospital like 20 years ago, but like they usually around like 9 o'clock, whatever, they just turn the lights off, so you like dim them a lot to make you sleep. So I assumed, oh, maybe this is like a thing where it's like, okay, it's time to sleep now, everyone, please go to bed, and you just crawl up into a ball and just think about your childhood, because that's all you think about, or at least all your personalities think about as well.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely implication there because there's always a lot of machinery next to the bed. as well that you can interact with.
Yeah, you just like framed it in a really poignant and meaningful way, Kamal. But all I thought of it was I thought it was quite funny that when you do go to sleep, it plays the it plays the light-hearted music that you'd usually hear when you're playing Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy or something and you go to sleep at the inn. But instead of your character actually getting into bed, they curl up and lean on the side of the bed, and it looks like they're just sort of wrestling with their inner demons and stuff.
Yeah, the way he goes to sleep, like, well, you just sit, he puts his head in his hands.
Yeah,
doesn't he?
yeah.
God bless. All right, so I guess.
Do you want to talk about the final part, the final boss and the final
Yeah,
part?
so I think we've covered. I think we've covered the ending
Ooh.
of the game, but I think
Actually, there was one last thing. Did we talk about Crow?
no, we kind of skipped over
Crow's an
those.
absolutely foul little bastard. That's all I've
Yeah,
got
we
to say about
skipped
him.
over a bit of Little and Tall Boy as
Yeah, we
well.
did. I think we
Yeah.
had to for the
Yeah.
sake of time.
I will say
but
though, I
may-
think
may-
Little and Tall Boy was my favourite part of the game. I think it was the part when the narrative was probably most straightforward,
Hmm.
and I quite enjoyed Little's struggle. It seemed like that was where it seemed to me it presented the idea to me of multiple personalities coming out for different reasons, and it seemed like the reason why Little had created another personality for himself was to kind of escape the guilt for the things he'd done wrong, and I quite enjoyed that.
Absolutely. Maybe we can do an addendum for some of the deeper character dives. I'm just cognizant that we probably want to get under 2.5 hours for this, and I think we're gonna have to skip probably talking about the music as well, which is something I wanted to mention.
It was very good. There was a lot of vocal sounds. They were nice. They were very ethereal.
Yeah.
It was creepy. I really liked the music, and I particularly liked Agatha's theme, which was just silent for ages and then punctuated with a really loud vocal trill. But anyway, let's talk about post-credits then, essentially, which brings us back full circle to the Fat Controller, right? Or, as we've discussed, Father Christmas?
Yeah, possibly.
Question mark?
Yeah.
So basically, at the end, they hit you with the classic, well, what a great story that was. I hope to tell you many more.
On the back.
Yeah. I hope to tell you many more stories. By the way, I might be Father Christmas. in a kind of weird, like, snow globe style, Citizen Kane zoom out.
I mean, it is literally a snow globe, isn't it?
Yeah, which is
showing a house, showing what seems to be a house on Mars with a rocket
it's
ship.
very tropey.
Yeah,
unfortunately, but it's still interesting. I think
Mickey calls you Little Husk.
Oh yeah,
very strange.
As well.
I think personally, I would have preferred the game without the sort of meta.
Yeah, it
narrative.
feels very tacked on. Like
Yeah.
nothing would really change if that opening and ending framing device didn't exist.
I think it's because, again, it wasn't addressed, like Kamal was mentioning before, where he mentions the idea of that, because the guy at the beginning is like, well, what would you do if you were suddenly somebody else?
Yeah.
And then it's not really directly addressed. There isn't like a very clear part. Maybe it's because I'm not picking up on it, but it didn't feel to me like there was a point in it where it was just like, look, you're doing the thing, but it's not you. Look, it's not you. And it was never really explicitly, the points that he brought up were never addressed, and then when he appears at the end, he doesn't. It's not like a case of like tell someone, do it, then tell him again. Like he doesn't even mention the second time. Like both sides are quite disconnected, other than the very vague thing.
Yeah,
my theory about this character is that obviously no one ever creates a video game with the intention that it's going to be their last. And I think the whole idea of the framing device with Planet Laika is that more games, either within a similar series or more games related to Laika, would have the same framing device. That this would be a character who introduces stories to players, and that each game would have the player question the role that they play within it, because he says at the beginning, "What would you do, if you were somebody
No, but
else?"
I think I will sort of defend the framing device, as it enhances the artificiality of it.
that is very true.
And I think it does make you think more.
Well, I say it makes you think more until you forget about the framing device, until it appears again right at the end, and they're like,
I
this
totally forgot
happened.
about it, and then when I did reach it, I was like, oh yeah, this guy, he was there at the start, wasn't he?
And I think it's a question of like, it's how we engage with media, but like That's the thing, is at the end saying, can you think about how this made you feel? Does that actually make me think more about how I
Yeah.
felt?
The thing is, it didn't need to be said,
No.
right? The game made me think plenty without the fat control appearing at the end and me going basically, well,
Yeah.
well, that's curious, wasn't it? What a curious story. So that, I mean, maybe the most inappropriate thing we can do to end this discussion of Planet Like is to ask everybody to give the game a rating.
No, Patrick, wait. We're gonna have to give this a Roger Ebert rating out of 10. So please, could you? What would he
I want
give
everyone
this?
to give a numerical value out of 10. I think would be the way I'd want to hear this. So let's
Can we give sort of a brief sort of just explanation of why we gave it that score as well?
okay. Let's try and sum it up in a sentence.
Yeah,
What
that's
we
fine.
haven't done is actually say our thoughts about the game as a whole. I thought each of us should be allowed to say
Okay,
that.
well, I'll start then and just go super quickly. I think I was the most positive on the game out of everybody, just from our discussions before recording this. I personally give the game a 9 out of 10. I thought it was excellent in most ways. I think it's worth giving a shout out here as well. I think Kargadin, who did the translation, the fan translation. I should also shout out Esper Knight and Mr. Nobody, who also worked on the translation. But I thought the translation did a really excellent job of bringing across all these characters and themes in a semi-understandable way. And I think each character had a unique voice, and I just thought it was a really cool translation, a really cool project to translate. But I thought the game was so interesting. It's very rare, I think, to find games, even today, that aren't, especially that aren't indie games in the traditional sense, that take on these themes and complex matters and at least try to wrestle with them. It didn't succeed in every way. In fact, it probably didn't succeed in most ways, but you know what? The attempt was damn well good enough to keep me really, really engaged throughout the entire thing. So those are my 2 cents on it. Do you want to go next, Raf?
Yeah, I'll go next. In my opinion, this game has fluctuated a lot uh, throughout my playing of it. I think the game at its best is exactly as you describe. It's about sort of really looking deep into the characters and the trauma, and just stuff you don't see elsewhere. And if I'm going to put my video game patrician hat on, it's all video games can be
I don't think you have one of those, Raf.
can be so much, and this game really tries to expand the medium, but at its worst, it's meandering, it's confusing, it commits the cardinal sin of just being practically nonsense by the end of it, and sort of going into really big sort of like prophecies are always a media should just avoid prophecies, if I can say that. And so in the end, I'm going to give it a 6.5 because while it has some really strong elements, a 10-hour experience when I'm not enjoying myself for a large chunk of the time is not a good experience.
All right. Ben, you go next.
Yeah, so let me just organize these notes in my head. I think, for my instance, the main thing. So this isn't like it's one sentence, but this is a game where it's not so much a narrative; it's about themes. That is very much not me. Or I think in explicit terms, when you have a game that's about themes, if you personally don't relate to the themes, in my case at least, I struggle. And I'm a person. I'm quite like confident about my identity. I've never questioned it that much. And so all these themes about personalities, identity, and faces and souls all totally bounced off me. However, the thing I like about these games is that you can talk about them, and other people have different interpretations. And so I was waiting for this to up my score a little bit because I really what I wanted out of this was not to actually have my own take, but to process everybody else's. And I really think I've done that through this, and it's been very good. Game itself, I like the idea. Didn't like the theme. I wanted it to be more, I guess, linear. Really, all the parts of it that interested me the most, like the Martians, and I can kind of understand with the theme of them being they are unknowable. They're the background, they're the context. But all the parts that interested me, that piqued my curiosity the most, were the parts that were left in the background. And I really got bogged down in the colony and the little wacky critters. And a lot of the things you guys, maybe I'm just watching gore videos all day and not like being the most sensitized to things. But a lot of the things you were describing earlier as like horrifying or like they just went straight through my brain. Like I didn't even process them, and like I think all that it's really good. It's unique, but it didn't grab me enough, and I don't think it fully put across, for me at least, what it was trying to get at. Although the subject matter was very good and it was presented very nicely. Um, Originally, I was going to say 6, but after doing this and having a very grand old time discussing it, which is where I think the merit comes from in these kind of games, as I said, I'm taking it up to a 7.
Nice. That's good to hear. All right, Victor,
Alrighty.
you hit us next.
So I think most of what I'm going to say will be an amalgamation of things that you guys have already said, because I agree with most, if not all, of your opinions. I think I admire this game more for its ambition than for what it actually ended up achieving. I really respect that it's a commercial release published by a major publisher like Enix for the PlayStation in 1999 that was clearly made to realize a very specific vision in a very specific setting with a very specific aesthetic that was going to obviously alienate the vast majority of a potential player base at that time. But I do think that it ended up biting off a lot more than it could chew in terms of themes. It's got so many different ideas and themes, from mental health to abuse to the ego to fate and individuality. And I'd say out of the maybe 8 or 9 of these things which it introduces, it only really brings 1 or 2 of these themes to a satisfying sort of conclusion by the end with a message you can take from it. So that's what I feel about the writing of the game. In terms of the gameplay, I agree with Raf and Ben that the entire experience ended up being bogged down quite badly by quite a meandering pacing to the gameplay, where you're most of the time just going up and down the colony, trying to trigger the next flag so that the story can continue. But I did very much enjoy the combat system. I thought it was very interesting and unique, and I enjoyed it every time it came up. So those are my thoughts on the game. I am also going to give it a 6.5 out of 10.
Nice. Thank you, Victor. All right, Kamal, do you want to finish this off?
Yeah, I'll just bullet point it because you guys pretty much all given exactly what I think. But basically, it has a really cool story, but I just wish it wasn't as rushed. Walking around looking for stuff can be quite tiring. Characters are all really interesting, but I kind of wish they were explored a bit more, especially like what's his name, Smokey, and even the guy in the bar. We just sort of see him once, and that's it, pretty much. It's really scary in both visuals and character actions. Because as we discussed, a lot of the character actions can be quite messed up. As for the actual combat, it's unique, but it's also really simple. And once you found out that you can just hold X, that's about what you do the entire game. The music is really good, and I'll also end this with, it reminds me that exclusivity can sometimes bring out games like these because consoles need really good exclusives. Personally, like I usually overrate games ever so slightly. I kind of rank things on I don't rank things on a 1 out of 10. I rank things on like a 1 out of 5 and then put it in a 1 out of 10. But I think I'd give this 7.5. So maybe that might be a little bit too high. But I enjoyed it. At least when I wasn't walking around just doing nothing.
Nice. That's great. Thank you, guys. Yeah, and I think that shows an interesting kind of mix of ratings. I think I was definitely the outlier, but I guess it also depends on what you personally value within the project. So it's interesting to hear that. I think our thoughts were all quite similar, though, in terms of criticisms and strengths for the
Mhm.
game.
Yeah, it becomes about what you end up focusing on highlighting. I'll be honest, I surprised myself in being in the lowest set of scores because it's like, oh, I love metaphors, I love psychological discussions and horror, but that's sort of the risk you play when you play video games. You have to control
Speaking
it.
about video games, I guess I should. I don't know who's actually going to listen to this, but I'm going to say thank you anyway for joining us for the first episode of I'm Not Going to Play That,
Thank you so much for listening to our cast.
the Video Game Book Club podcast.
Good job.
I think I should also end by just saying that the next game that we're going to play is LOL Lack of Love.
Hell yeah, baby.
So yeah, you can look forward to listening to us talk about that next time, hopefully.
And it won't be
Yeah,
this
it
long.
won't be this long, that's for sure. That game's like 3 hours long.
Well, obviously, we played as a prelude to this. We played Gurumin before this as a sort of test run for this, and maybe I'm sort of retconning that a bit. But had we done that about that game, there would have been so much little to talk about because it is so much more of a game than a story, and we'd all probably have just discussed mechanics and then
Got annoyed at the lack of mechanics.
Yeah. So this is definitely, I think, a good one to start with on the grounds
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
it was a very open discussion point.
All right, excellent. So we'll call it there then. I've got to make sure this is all recorded properly. I hope to God it has. Even if it hasn't, it's been fun though. All right, well see
Thanks,
you guys
boys.
shortly.
Later.
Peace out.
Stay gaming, gamers.